Before I moved out of my hometown, I was working as a waiter at Waffle House. Chose to work the third shift because I had the best hourly pay and brought in pretty good tips due to us being the only 247 diner in the entire town. It took me about a year to save up enough money, though, to rent a place in the city and get out of the middle of nowhere. But that time I saw quite a few things that still stick with me to this day. By and large, most of the customers I had were truckers and other random people traveling on the interstate. Through the middle of the night, the town was just a stopover point, not a destination, as much the quote-unquote locals consisted of farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area, and anyone else like me worked in the fast food and hotel chains clustered around the interstate exit. The final and yet the most characteristic residents of that depressing cesspit of a town where the vagrants, hitchhikers, tweakers, and destitute opportunists that had been stranded with us, they could be stuck there from anywhere to a few days to several years, clinging to the parking lots and awnings that were the only meager shelter for dozens of miles in any direction, panhandling for whatever they could until they got lucky enough to get a ride to somewhere else. Really, the only stressful part of my job was dealing with these people in the beginning. I tried to be empathetic after all. They are human. However, it didn't take long to end up like my usual coworker, the cook that had been there for 15 years and had seen just about everything. His name was Carl, and the only thing separating him from them was a steady position at the grill. Nobody ever got a chair thrown at them as far as I know, but Carl was prone to throwing turners and other utensils at anyone who got on his bad side. I usually followed his lead based on his body language. He knew who was trouble and who wasn't. However, even with Carl, his reliable backup things sometimes got out of hand. There was this one night that I'll never forget. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but all I know was that it had been unusually slow that night. It was around 4 in the morning when the Sky walked in, and even I knew something was not right about him. He was wearing soiled clothes and a completely torn-up jacket covered head to toe in dust, and he was in a completely panicked state of mind. The weird thing was that he said nothing as he ran past us, clutching his right arm to his chest and immediately locking himself in the bathroom. Carl and I rolled our eyes at the same time. Here we go again, we thought. Although I think we both had a feeling this wasn't a regular hobo bathroom emergency or a tweaker looking for a private place to do their thing. That's when I asked Carl, doesn't he kind of look familiar? He brushed it off at first, but then after a short conversation we realized that he had been inside about 2 hours ago, desperately asking all the customers for rides until eventually we had to kick him out for being a disturbance. It seemed he obviously hadn't had any luck on getting a ride, but something else had happened to him too. I became worried if that guy needed help. It would be a while before an ambulance could get to him, and even longer for them to take him to a hospital. Carl told me to take care of it, so I ran the check for the only customer we had in the store at the time, and got them on their way when I took the bathroom keys and went to check on our stranger in distress. I knocked on the door pretty loud, and asked if everything was okay. There was a pause, then, finally, a distraught voice answered me. "I think I'm really hurt. I just need a ride." Suddenly, I knew something was seriously wrong. The sound of his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I fumbled with the key ring as I told him I was about to open the door. "Sir, if you need help, I have to come in there," I shouted. "No." The stranger screamed, "You have to come get me." I stopped for a second, confused, but then I snapped out of it and shoved the key in the lock and turned it, then opened the door to a terrifying sight. The bathroom was empty, completely empty. No injured man, no blood, no dust, just nothing. It was as clean as it had been since I last cleaned it, as if nobody had been in there at all. In fact, it even looked cleaner than that. "What's going on in there?" Carl shouted from the kitchen. I was just at a loss. I let the bathroom door close and I stepped back. I looked at Carl and told him the truth. "There's nobody in there," I said. "Don't give me that." Carl shouted, "See for yourself." I told him, and he did. He stormed over and barged through the bathroom door. I saw him go blank, just like I did when he saw it. The impossible absence of a person. He turned around and looked inside the woman's room too, but again, nothing. Nobody in raw disbelief. We gathered ourselves behind the counter. We interrogated each other uselessly, thinking one of us must have let him slip by unnoticed. However, we both knew. We had been on high alert since the second he came in. There was no way neither of us would have not noticed him leaving. Within a fraction of a second, our conversation ended, as we both saw the same thing out of the corner of her eyes. Stranger was somehow outside, looking at us through the window. He still had his right arm stuffed out of sight. But now, as we got more of an eye full of his face than we ever wanted to, he saw that wasn't his only problem. His face was bloody like he'd been hit with a brick. His nose was broken into and lip was split, and missing a piece showing us his cracked and missing teeth. One of his eyes seemed completely swollen over, but the one that was open was gushing blood. Carl and I didn't move a muscle. We didn't even breathe. Breathe for a second after a few horrible seconds of realizing what was happening. I finally thought to call 911. But as soon as the idea occurred to me, the man started to move. He turned to the side and started to limp across the big front window. We watched him in silence. He made it all the way to the corner of the window where it wrapped around to the other side. "What the hell?" I whispered, only for Carl to quickly shush me. Was at that moment I saw he had gone pale and wide-eyed, which only terrified me even more. Something about this man had gotten through Carl's defenses, and that meant we were not prepared before we could say anything else. We heard a crash from the back room. We both ran inside and searched for the source of the noise. It was coming from the walk-in freezer. Somebody was tearing things up and freaking out. Carl ran up there and threw open the door, and there he was, that guy. He had ripped open a box of burger, EIES, and was clutching a handful of meat, pressing it to his right arm like an ice bag. When he saw us, he froze. The patties dropped from his hand and revealed the condition of his arm. His hand was stuck in a thumbs-up position, but his wrist had been snapped clean off, and his hand was dangling from the rest of his arm by a thread of skin after a terrifying moment of deer and headlight stares. The stranger bolted from the freezer, crashing through both me and Carl. He sprinted outside, screaming, before we had a chance to react. I stumbled to my feet as Carl ran out to the dining area and locked the front doors and switched off all the lights. Then he pushed me back into the back room and started yelling at me. "How could you leave the back door unlocked?" he yelled. "No, look, it's still locked." I pointed to the back door and sure enough, it was locked. Now, absolutely nothing was making sense, but we gave up on trying to decipher it the rest of the night until the sun came up and the morning crew came in. We kept the doors locked and stayed out of sight when we were finally freed from our nightmare of a shift and set out into the world. We noticed the train of police and paramedics on the freeway right outside of town. We asked around only to find out that a man had been killed in a hit and run right there at the off-ramp, not even 1,000 feet from the Waffle House. He died some time after midnight, but his body laid on the shoulder undiscovered until daylight. His corpse was mangled, but his thumb was still sticking straight up from trying to hitch her ride. Of course, by the afternoon, they had scraped him off the pavement and washed away his blood until the spot in which he died was cleaner than I had ever seen it. During the summer last year, I chose to not take any classes, and I got a job at a gas station right next to my college campus. I was sort of delusioned with school and wanted to make some money while I had time off. The gas station was one of the first places I tried applying to, and it turned out to be the last when they hired me on the spot. Thought it was a little weird, but I didn't question it. Unfortunately, they said they only wanted me for the night shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I knew it would wreak havoc on my already messed up sleep schedule, but I decided to go for it and just see how it went. To my surprise, most of the time, it wasn't that bad. The first few hours of the shift were pretty busy and it would get crazy, but then it would always get really slow till about 5 o'clock in the morning, which gave me plenty of time to clean stock the shelves and chill out until the morning. Rush, occasionally, somebody suspicious or problematic would wander in, but I never had anything get too out of hand. Well, that was, of course, until something did happen. It was a Thursday, which wasn't usually a busy night. I had a coworker until about midnight. Then they went home and I was left alone. Time went by pretty fast, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's around the time a man walked in, and I immediately had a bad feeling about him. He had a shaved head and a bunch of tattoos of weird symbols, so I was pretty sure he was a skinhead. I noticed he had parked his dirty old lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot too, but I didn't want to get on his case about it, and I ended up getting called slurs because I looked Jewish to him. It was 1:58 when he walked in, and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, though, all he brought up to buy was a case of beer. However, by then it was 2011 in my county, has a law that says alcohol can't be purchased between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. I told the man that, and politely and apologetically as I could, that he couldn't buy the beer. He immediately became agitated and went off on a rant about how it was a free country, and that was a stupid law. I tried my best to reason with him, and I said that I was just trying to do my job, but this only made him start to criticize me like I was some kind of spineless pond for my boss. That's when I asked him to leave if he was going to be that way. Then he suddenly changed his tone again, acting all chummy and saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should bend the rules for just a few minutes since it was before 2 when he walked in. I mean, he kind of did make a good point, so I eventually caved, just so he would get out. I sold him the case of beer, and then of course he asked for a pack of cigarettes to go with it. I let him have it, as there was no rule against tobacco. He smiled at me and then left the store, and I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. However, thought he would get in his truck and leave, but instead he opened the tailgate and sat down on the truck bed, cracked open a can of beer, and started drinking it. Now, I had a feeling that this was far from over, and that was exactly the case because a few minutes later, another truck pulled up right next to his, and a couple of guys got out, both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. They stood around the back of the first guy's truck, just smoking and drinking. I knew I had to go out there and tell them that they couldn't loiter in front of the store, and that it was illegal to drink out in the open like that. Anyway, especially that close to a car, but I was a little scared already. They kept looking in the window at me, just smirking as if they knew what I was thinking, and they were challenging me to try it before I could find the courage. Though, another car, this time an SUV, pulled in next to the two of them, and 2 more guys got out and joined the others. They were all a part of the same skinhead group, without a doubt. My guess is they were coming from a bar that had just closed and didn't want to end the night. Yet that was the most reasonable and most likely explanation. But my paranoid thoughts made me think they were about to get together and burn down the store. The owner's wife was Mexican, and then the first guy came back into the store. He was drunker than before and all smiles. But then he came back to the register with another case of beer. I was about to tell him he definitely couldn't buy it that time, but before I could even open my mouth, he looked at me all smug and said I really wouldn't want to disappoint him and all of his friends. I took that as a pretty solid threat, and I let him do what he wanted. Again, my hands were shaking and I was dreading having to count change in front of him, but then he told me to keep the change, like he was giving me some kind of big tip. He walked back outside and all the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beard. Apparently they had worked together and finished all 24 cans of the previous one. And then I realized that they had been tossing the empty cans all over the ground and kicking them around. It felt like I was completely stuck with these pricks, and I knew I would get in trouble over it, at best, or get literally ganged up on and have any manner of horrible things done to me just for saying no to them. What normal person would see the meeting of a bunch of drunk skinheads smoking cheap cigarettes on top of their pickup trucks in front of a store in the middle of the night and still want to walk past them to get in? Pretty much nobody. Not a single person except more of the skinheads. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up and I locked the door so they couldn't get back in. Then I walked back in the office and called the police. Several minutes later, a cruiser showed up and told him to screw off. There was some shouting outside that I couldn't quite make out, but I was worried for a few minutes that things would escalate. Thankfully, they left without causing too much of a scene, but I have no idea how close it got. The cop waited for them to leave before doing so himself. Right before he got on his way, I came out and asked him to stay a while I cleaned up their mess in Keisha. Decided to show up and kick my ass for ruining their little party. The next day, I unfortunately had to quit that job. There was nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of being stuck behind that register. If those guys ever decided to come back still, I kind of get worried that one of them will see me around town and recognize me. Don't know what those people are all capable of. All I know is my town is full of dudes like that, and they're always causing problems. Years ago, I worked as a barista at a locally owned coffee shop that doubles as a popular venue for local artists and musicians to host all sorts of small-time gigs. Even today, it gets most of its business in the evenings during the open mics, and it stays open until 2 a.m. However, when I worked there, pre-2020, they were open 24/7, from Thursday to Sunday. For the most part, everyone that worked there hated the graveyard shift. It was easy hours, but the tips were abysmal, as barely anyone came in as far as myself was considered. However, I didn't mind the lower pay. What I hated was being alone and running the only place that was still open for miles. The shop was in a good part of town, if not a little close to a bad part. But the fact of the matter is that there's really no such thing as a good side of town during these overnight hours. That is, if we're being completely honest, I was advised to never keep more than $50 in the drawer during the graveyard shift. For a reason, I was always afraid that somebody would drag me into the back of the store, so every time I was scheduled for the overnight shift, I asked one of my male friends to come hang out with me. The one guy that would help me, more than anyone else, was named Nick. It usually turned out to be a good time. I made some money and I slipped him some beers under the table, and of course I felt much more comfortable not being a woman on her own. Nick would work on his laptop while I was busy, and we would talk when things were slow. We had been friends for a while, but we became close. After spending a lot of time together, it was always platonic. Though Nick was also friends with many of my co-workers, and lots of us joked that Nick knew so much about the coffee shop that he might as well work there himself. He always laughed it off and said his career in photography was more important, which we always gave him a hard time for. I didn't really think there would ever be any bad blood between us. And if there was, I was sure it'd be, because we slipped up and had an awkward one-night stand. But then came a slow Saturday night in the summer of 2019. I was working the last overnight shift of the weekend. I had worked the last 2 nights in a row without Nick, because he had bailed on me to go to a wedding for one of his family members. I managed to get another friend of mine to fill in for him for Thursday and Friday, but on Saturday night, they were too tired and never showed up. I was anxious about being alone in the shop, but I knew I could manage. Thankfully, it was surprisingly slow that night. for some reason, and by 3 a.m. I had only made $10 in tips, but I was glad I didn't have to deal with any crazy people. Unfortunately, that's when things took a dark turn. Shop was completely empty except for me. I was putting a batch of coffee into the roaster when out of the corner of my eye I saw a figure walk past the front window. I glanced over, but there was nobody there. I waited for someone to come around to the back door, which customers could also use, but a full minute had passed now and nobody came. Stuck around by the register for a few more minutes. But after nobody showed up for a while, I decided it was time to mop the floors. I went into the back to fill up the mop bucket, and of course, as soon as I turned the faucet on, I heard somebody come in through the phone door. I shouted that I would be with them in just a minute. Then I finished filling up the bucket and rolled it out behind the counter. When I got there, whoever came in had disappeared. I shrugged it off, just figuring they had gone straight to the bathroom, and then I started mopping behind the counter. The stranger's feeling hovered over me, though I couldn't place what it was, but I knew something was wrong. The first thing I looked at was the drawer, but it hadn't been broken into even then. That would have been loud enough for me to hear over the running water. I leaned over the bar and checked the bathroom doors. The men's room door was closed and the light was on, so I knew somebody was in there. My stomach churned slightly as I knew it was a man in there, but so far I had no real reason to think anything was wrong, so I just kept on mopping. When I finally got finished behind the counter, the bathroom door opened and to my surprise, Nick walked out. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but I had to ask him what he was doing there. He explained that he'd just got home from the wedding and thought he'd stop by and say, "Hi." I was grateful that he decided to show up, so I told him he could have whatever he wanted on the house. So I got behind the espresso machine and got to work, pulling a shot. I packed the grounds into the portafilter and locked it into the machine, then looked over to say something to Nick. But whatever I was thinking of saying was immediately forgotten. His facial expression had gone from friendly to devilish in just a moment of time, and suddenly a wave of chills went through my body. "What are you doing?" I asked, fighting back. Trembling, Nick grinned like a psychopath and pulled a knife out from behind his back. "I'm finally going to bang the barista," he said as he started to laugh. "Don't be crazy," I shouted. "We're friends." "What about the cameras?" Nick began walking forward, forcing me to backpedal. "We are friends," he said, "and nobody will believe you, because the cameras aren't even on. They never are." "How do you not know that I knew?" At this point, I was being pushed into the back of the shop, and my throat started to close up. It was also in that moment when I looked for an exit that I realized he had locked both the doors and turned the open sign off, keeping anybody from coming in. "Your boss already thinks we do this every night." Nick pressed on, inching closer and closer. "Stop it," I shouted in desperation, looking for something to defend myself, trying to not slip on the wet floor. "Shut up," he screamed. "You should have been giving this to me for months already. Do not know how much time I wasted on you." I was pleading and about to be cornered. The last hope I had was something on the sandwich counter the last moment, before he pushed me out of sight into the back of a shop. I grabbed for the panini press and ripped it off the table, slamming the corner of the metal against the side of his head. He tried to block me and sliced open my arm, but I connected the hit, and combined with the water on the floor, the blow knocked him off of his feet. I wasted 0 seconds in climbing over the counter and rushing out of the back door and in my car, while I locked myself in and called the police. It wasn't until I thought about driving off that I realized Nick had parked his car in front of mine to deliberately keep me from getting away. Moments later, while I was on the phone with the operator, he came outside and attempted to break his way into my car. After he failed to do so for several minutes, he gave up and drove off. Not long before the police arrived, I was treated for my wound, and I gave my statement about what happened. I didn't leave out a single detail. I was too much in a state of shock to be even in disbelief. As it turns out, he was right about the cameras inside the shop just being for show. However, nobody thought I was lying about what he did. Unfortunately, though, due to civil liabilities on the part of my employer, and more importantly, the fact that Nick completely up and disappeared after posting bail, I decided to drop the charges, came to the conclusion not long after that he had already ruined his life sufficiently, and I simply didn't care enough to do anything else about it. Nobody has seen or heard from Nick in years, and the coffee shop has since stopped staying open overnight. People might think I quit because of what happened, but I actually continued to work there until just a few months ago. I used to work as a night clerk in a downtown condominium. The association had a lot of security concerns due to the way the building was constructed. Back in the late 60s, both levels of the parking garage were accessible from street level, so there were a lot of possible entry points, many of which were located in blind spots of the security camera system. For that reason, I was required to make 2 rounds around the entire building during my shift to make sure no non-residents had found their way in. The most serious issue that we had was the occasional carjacking, but what I encountered most often was homeless people who had found their way into the garage and were huddling in some corner for a bit of shelter, kicking them back out into the street. Was by far my least favorite part of the job, but I had to do it after working there for several months. I knew all the spots that people like to hide in the building, was very old, and had undergone many renovations in its lifetime, which created a lot of nooks and crannies, unnecessary concrete protrusions, sealed-off rooms and hallways, and stairs that led to nowhere. The creepiest spot in the whole building was so weird and potentially dangerous that I took a picture of it and I brought it up to management on the first floor of the garage. There was a door that opened up to a corridor, direct lie underneath the ramp, up to the second level of the garage. It was about 3 feet wide and ran about 20 to 30 feet, but it led to literally nowhere. At the end of it was a large water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason the space existed. But in the dark, with just a weak flashlight, that pipe seemed to take many other forms. What made it dangerous, however, was the lock on the door. There was no padlock or keyhole on either side, but on the outside was a large sliding bolt latch. There was only one way in or out, and it locked from the outside with no ways to unlock it from the inside. Ever since I discovered the spot, I couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for someone to get trapped in there. However, nothing I said to management made any difference. They were already aware of it and had no intention of doing anything about it. Unfortunately, that meant I would have to open the door and check on it every night, but I never stepped foot inside of it. I was way too scared of it. Things went on like that for months, and then one day my worst fear was realized. It was about 3 in the morning. Halfway through my shift, I was doing my rounds in the parking garage and everything was normal. It was a slow Wednesday night. There hadn't been any problems or suspicious activity on the cameras, so I was far from on edge at the time. But then, in one moment, I was forced to go on alert. I heard the sound of a door slamming across the garage. I wasn't exactly sure where it was, so I walked over to investigate. My heart sank a bit. When I saw that the door to the dead-end hallway was wide open, I looked around to see if anyone was in the garage, but I appeared to be alone. I shouted to intimidate anyone if they were hiding somewhere I couldn't see, but I got no response and nobody appeared. I was just worried that there was somebody hiding in the dead-end hallway, so I walked the rest of the way. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, and for a moment I was relieved to see that nobody was in there. There was, however, an empty glass bottle about 10 feet inside. I sighed and rolled my eyes, thinking that somebody had been drinking in there, and they ran out in a hurry once they saw me snooping around accidentally, making noise as they rushed. It wouldn't have been that hard for somebody to climb up on the cars parked there to get above the wall and hop the fence into the neighboring parking lot. By the time I got there, since the garage was partially underground in that spot. In fact, that's how a lot of people get in, because the dead-end hallway happened to be in a prominent blind spot of the cameras. I wasn't allowed to leave trash anywhere if I saw it, so I knew I had to pick up that bottle. Of course, I felt the anxiety bubbling up inside my gut. Just for knowing I had to walk a few steps inside that hallway, I almost didn't do it, but I rationalized myself into thinking there was no way somebody would pop out and lock me in. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, but right as I reached the bottle, the door slammed shut. I immediately ran back to the door, but by the time I got there, it was already locked. I started banging on the door and screaming for help. There was nobody there. I felt like I was being buried alive, like I could barely breathe. If it weren't for my flashlight, I would have been in some deep trouble. I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Once I realized I wasn't getting out anytime soon, I reached for my phone to my utter heartbreak. However, there was no service at all. The walls were made of cinder blocks and the door was made of metal. Plus, the entire 6-story building was on top of me. No matter what I tried, I couldn't call 911. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I was completely stuck. The only way I was getting out was if somebody opened the door from the outside, but it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and it would be hours before anybody left for work in the morning. And during that time, whoever trapped me was doing whatever they pleased in the parking garage. I heard several car alarms go off, and I knew what was happening. Somehow they all turned off. After a few minutes, I kept banging on the door and shouting, but nobody came after a while. If I'm being completely honest, I gave up that I would be free anytime soon, and I just focused on staying calm. I sat down against the wall and I turned off my flashlight to save the battery, but only after making sure I was completely alone. Every few minutes, I banged on the door. A bunch of times. It took me like 2 hours. But finally, I managed to get the attention of somebody going to work early in the morning. I thanked them as they let me out. But unfortunately, the next thing I had to do was call the cops, because I quickly noticed that a dozen cars had been broken into. There was broken glass all over the parking lot, from all the windows that had been shattered. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to trap me in there, and they knew how to silence the alarms of the cars they were breaking into. We only have security guards on the weekends, and it left us vulnerable on a seemingly benign Wednesday. All in all, there were tens of thousands of dollars done in damages in theft, and I was fired from my job. Not like I would want to go back anyway. Cole was never identified on the cameras, and it was never caught. I've been a night owl my whole life, so I work night shifts exclusively. I really don't work well with other people, whether they're my co-workers or not, so I picked a job I could do completely on my own and became a nighttime janitor my local school district. After I graduated from high school, schools have always had nightly cleaning as a part of health codes in most areas, but obviously in recent years it's become much more important. My first job was in a fairly large K-12. There were a couple of daytime custodians as well, but at the night it was just me and one other person splitting the school down the middle. My coworkers and I barely ever interacted, which I appreciated a lot. Every single night, all the floors get mopped or vacuumed. Every desk, table, and door handle is disinfected, and every toilet, euro, and sink also gets cleaned. It takes a full 8-hour shift to accomplish, and for that entire time, I don't talk to a single person. It's great. Honestly, most of my coworkers are women, and they don't want me talking to them either. When I tell people about my job, a lot of them think the hardest part is having to clean up after the messes left by the students. And for the most part, I guess they are right. but I always tell them I would rather plunge and clean 10 clogged and traumatized toilets every single night than ever have to do work directly with another human being all day long, especially a horde of mine. These days, there's one example I give of why I say that. It was the night after Halloween. I came in for my usual 8 to 5 shift and got started without even saying hello to my coworker. We started on opposite ends and met in the middle, so we would only see each other when we were finishing up. The first hour was mostly normal, except for one obvious thing out of ordinary. I always keep my music at a low volume on my headphones, but from outside them I kept hearing things. Usually all the other faculty are gone by 8 o'clock, but sometimes there's somebody who stays late. I couldn't decide what I was hearing through my music, but I wasn't in the mood to turn it off, so I just ignored it. A little while later, I took a break from mopping to change the water in the bucket. I was gone for about 5 minutes, but on my way back to where I stopped, I walked past one of the hallways I had just mopped and noticed the wet floor sign had fallen over for legal reasons. I had to step over the wet floor and stand it back up, then mop back over my tracks on the way out. Annoyed, I walked over to it, but I froze for a moment when something else caught my eye. There was another set of tracks in the water leading to and from the sign. They were little footprints, something a kid would make after I stood the sign back up. I followed the tracks knowing I would have to mop over those too, basically redoing the whole hallway. The tracks ran all the way to the end, where there was a flight of stairs up the second floor. From there, they dried up pretty quickly. I stormed up the stairs and got to the second floor, but nobody was there. I took my phone out of my pocket and paused my music, so if anyone was running around, I would be able to hear them. Right as I looked down, I saw a flash of movement at the end of the hallway. I also heard a bunch of footsteps echoing across the empty school, so I started making my way to the end of the hall. By the time how I got there, I still couldn't see anyone, but then I heard a little kid laughing. It felt like I was in a horror movie, but at that point I was more annoyed than scared. I stood there looking around for a few seconds until I heard a crash from the first floor. I rushed downstairs and nearly flipped my lid when I saw the mop bucket I had just refilled was knocked over. The water was spilling everywhere in a huge pool. I absolutely swore my head off as I went back to the nearest janitor's closet, it for a dry mop and bunch of towels. It took me half an hour to clean up that mess, and then another 15 minutes to redo the hallway that got messed up, which meant my lunch break was down to 15 minutes. However, I was so pissed off that I walked to the other side of the school and interrupted my coworker to ask if she had been messing with me. She looked completely dumbfounded and innocent. She asked if I was all right or needed any help, but to that I just walked away. I set up again and got back to work. Another hour passed and I managed to make up some lost progress. I was angrily powering through it, debating in my head the whole time about what I should do. I thought about reporting into the school or maybe just calling the police myself. But in the end, I figured I would seem crazy to everyone, just like I did to my coworker. So nothing happened again until 11 o'clock out of nowhere. The lights shut off in the whole school. It was pitch black for about 3 seconds until the dim emergency lights turned on, and then everything had a reddish hue to it. It came as a shock to me, and to be honest, I was worried. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction or maybe some kids messing around, but my mind was going to all sorts of possibilities. I had keys to the electrical room where the light switches were, and I was the closest to it. So I stopped what I was doing and marched over. I was pissed off about losing more time and missing out on my entire lunch break. But halfway there, something pushed those concerns out of my head. I heard the most blood-curdling scream of my life, the panic shriek of my coworker echoing endlessly. I stopped in my tracks, feeling like I had just been hit by an electric shock. Seconds later, I heard the sound of a door opening really loudly, like someone was ramming through it from the inside. I hoped it was my coworker escaping and not somebody else making their way into the school. I forced myself to keep going and finally made it to the electrical room. I was right outside the door, trying to find the right key. When I noticed that it was already cracked open, I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might see, and a shape appeared in front of me, standing unnaturally in the darkness. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone I gave up on trying to turn on the lights and instead reached over for my phone in my pocket. However, as soon as I moved, the figure bolted forward and slammed the door in my face. I cursed, and then jumped back, stumbling until my back hit the wall behind me. Once I regained my balance, I started running. I wanted to leave, but for once in my life, I thought about the well-being of somebody else, and ran to the other side of the school to find my coworker. After checking a few of her hallways, I finally found her mop bucket sitting alone in the middle of the floor, next to a bathroom. Without hesitation, I rushed over to it, hoping to not see any evidence that she had been hurt. Nothing seemed unusual, except for the fact that she was nowhere to be found. I looked all around in the dim lighting, but as far as I could tell, I was alone, but not completely alone. The sound of a laughing child echoed in the distance, again striking fear into my chest. I clutched the handle of the mop for the lack of anything else to defend myself with, and I lifted it out of the bucket, holding the end of the handle out like a spear. I faced the direction of the laughter, looking down the hallway, so intently I got tunnel vision. In a moment of sheer terror, someone whispered hello into my ear. I turned around and, without thinking, I jabbed the handle of the mop into their chest. With all my might, I heard a grunt as the person that snuck up on me hit the ground, and they vomited only a second later. I shouted them to tell me who they were, but then they started to cry. I could tell they were trying to hold it back, but they couldn't. Gradually, my eyes made out what I was looking at, and it was a student kneeled over on the floor. Suddenly, all my fear of danger was replaced with the fear of losing my job for hitting a student. However, as things shook out over the next few days, it turned out all right. Two twins in the 9th grade and their little brother got the idea to keep the spirit of Halloween going and prank the overnighters in the school by hiding in the lockers. There was one set of lockers in the whole building that wasn't in use and had no locks or ties on them, and those kids were skinny enough to fit in there and hide after doing their after-school activities. They managed to get out of being expelled, probably from crying a lot. The school district understood my actions and let me keep my job, but I was transferred to a different school all in. All this is why I don't like people, especially kids. I really love Craigslist. I'd estimate I've met maybe 300 people for buying or selling stuff, and for the most part, everyone was nice and harmless. However, I did run into a few creeps who made me rethink meeting strangers alone to sell stuff. By the way, I was an early 20s female at the time. The first guy, it was 2009, and I'm staying with my parents for the Christmas holidays in a small town in Florida. I'm going through my childhood room and cleaning out the closet, and I find a giant CD holder, maybe full of 100 really shitty CDs. Think of Nickelback, Aquatruma, WBA, etc. It's the 21st century. No one uses CDs anymore. I figured I'd try to sell the CDs on Craigslist. I put up a listing, 100 CDs from the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. Mix of pop and rock, all for $35 the next day. I get an email from a guy named John around 2 p.m. He says that he's in town temporarily and that he wants 2 CD. He says that he can pick them up after dinner around 8 p.m. I email him back my address and number, and I tell him to text or call when he's on his way. 8 p.m. Comes and goes. I figure I've been stood up, which happens often on Craigslist. No big deal. My dad works for a liquor distribution company and would often do demonstration nights at restaurants and bars, and would come home at bar closing time. This night he gets home at around 3 a.m. I'm in college and a total night owl, so I'm still up probably eating junk food and surfing the web, maybe watching horror flicks. I hear car pull up and look out the window, and I see him sitting in his car eating food. He often stops at Taco Bell on his way home and eats it in his car, so my mom doesn't know he's cheating on his diet. Maybe 10 minutes later, my dad comes in and shouts my name. "There's someone here to see you. Can you please tell me why I, strange man, is showing up at her house at 3 a.m.? I think I go downstairs and my dad says some guy pull up in the driveway and ask for me by name. I walk outside with my dad and this guy, who is maybe mid-30s, gets out of his car. He says he's the Craigslist guy who wanted to buy my CDs. My dad goes back in the house. I tell the guy, it's really late to just be stopping by, especially without a text first. However, since I'm awake, I go and grab the CDs. He then proceeds to drone on and on about why he's buying the CDs. He says he's engaged to a woman he loves very much, and all he wants to do is make her happy. And that last week, someone broke into her car and stole all of her CDs. She was really upset, and he wanted to make it up to her. He looked on Craigslist and found my listing and was really excited because I had a bunch of the CDs she used to have. Weird thing is, I didn't list any of the artists or bands because I was lazy, but I didn't think about that at the time. Anyway, he said he was getting it for her as a Christmas surprise. He also said he was staying with his future in-law somewhere nearby, that their family barbecue ran really late, which is why he never made it at 8 p.m. By this point, I've lost interest, and I say something along the lines of, "That's sweet. Next time, you should probably call or text the Craigslist instead of just showing up." I hand him the CDs, and he hands me the cash, and I go back inside 3 days later. I start getting texts from an unknown number. "Hey, I don't know my way around this town car to tour guide. I could really use a massage. Where can I get a massage in this town? Would you take $40 for a 1-hour massage?" Happy ending me. Finally, who the... Is this him? Oh, sorry. I bought the CDs from you the other day. Do you squirt? By the way, I didn't respond. Obviously, I show my friends that night, and we laugh at. Off the next day, I get more texts. "I still have your address. I'm at the Bank of America, near your neighborhood. I just got the $40 babe. Only 3 minutes away. Are you home? I'm almost there." I immediately ran downstairs to tell my dad and mom. It was nighttime, so we shut off all the lights outside, and inside my house, my mom. Little brother and I went in my parents' room in the back of the house. My dad hid behind the curtains of the front bay window with a shovel in his hand. A few minutes later, I heard him run down the front hallway, fling the front door open, and run outside. We heard some faint shouting, so we all walked out of the bedroom. By that time, my dad came back in with his shovel, his face red as ever and his hair all disheveled. Apparently, the guy came driving down our street really slowly, and my dad recognized the car and went running outside with it, yelling obscenities at the guy. The guy peeled off and never came back or texted me again, really quick. I just want to tell you about the second guy that I met on Craigslist. That was really creepy. I was moving from Florida to DC, and I was going to load up my car as much as I could with stuff. However, I lived on the 3rd floor, plus a bit of a walk from my assigned parking spot, so I figured I could use some help. I posted an ad on Craigslist. I said I was looking for someone to help me load heavy items like a TV, a desk, etc. in my car, less than hours worth of work, and I'd pay $45 or whatever. I give the very first responder my number and address, and he shows up. He's probably about 5 feet 8 and 350 pounds of pure fat. The sweat and smell coming off of this guy, and the Florida heat was pretty nauseating, but I didn't care as long as he did the job right. While he was carting heavy stuff, I was loading lighter things whenever I'd go upstairs to grab another load. He'd hurry after me so he could walk up the stairs behind me. I had the door propped open so he didn't have to worry about me needing to unlock the door for him or anything. When he'd follow me up the stairs, he made these weird grunting noises like, but I assumed it was because he was out of shape. Eventually, everything's loaded properly except all the sweat smears on my stuff. I pay him and he drives off. I go back in my place to finish loading and cleaning. I go out maybe 45 minutes later to put another load in my car, and I see his truck is back parked across the street from mine. He's sitting in the driver's seat, looking at me when he sees me notice him. He looks away. I walk over to his window and knock. He rolls it down and I ask if he needed any help, or if he was lost. I was really confused. As to why he had come back, and I knew he didn't live near me, but he didn't say anything, just rolled his window back up and drove off. Okay, whatever. But of course, 5 minutes later, my phone starts blowing up. I don't recognize the number, so I answer the calls. Then the texts start rolling in. He said, "I bet you taste salty and sweet." Me, who is this him? What are you up to tonight? I can come back over. Then I get this sinking feeling that it's the Craigs. This guy, he had never called me about the job when I gave him my number, so I didn't know what his number was. Him, "I like your pink panties." Then I realized he was looking on my dress. When I was walking up the stairs, I immediately felt like a total idiot for wearing a dress that day. He then started dialing my number over and over again. I didn't know how to block the number thing through Sprint, so I had to just turn my phone off. Later, I was with my guy friend grabbing a bite and turned my phone back on. I got another text from the guy about how he wanted to toss me around like a rag doll. I show the text to my friend and tell him the story. The coolest creep then proceeds to start blowing up my phone again, so my friend answers and said, he's going to cut his dick off and feed it to his dog. If he ever contacts me again, I moved the next day, so I never had to worry about him randomly showing up in his truck again. But since then, I've sold stuff on Craigslist, but I always make people meet me at a public place. Last year, I was renting your house in a small, economically depressed old mining town in Virginia. I lived alone on one of the first warm nights of spring. I fell asleep in my living room on my recliner, but I unpleasantly awoke around 4 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob turning. I figured someone must have just had the wrong address or something, but the doorknob kept turning persistently. I didn't have a peephole or a window to see who was outside, so I just approached the door from the inside and yelled, "Hey, wrong place." Then the door started shaking violently and a hand began punching it. "Hey, seriously, get the hell off my property, wrong house." The man who was on the other side then growled at me and started making these weird and horrifying noises like a wild animal. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen drawer and called the police, and I waited inside for them to arrive. 2 officers showed up, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. The cops, SCA, sweep around the house and look for him thoroughly, but there was nobody. They left, and the police told me to call again if something comes up. So I went on about my day, and by now it was around 5 o'clock in the morning. I didn't go back to sleep because I was just too anxious about the whole situation. Later that evening, when I got home from work, I was concerned that maybe someone broke in. Now that was nothing more than my anxiety talking, and I had no reason to believe that. But that's all I could think about all day at work, was that same person was going to come back. Well, when I got home, everything seemed normal. No signs of anyone or a break-in or anything suspicious at all. Fast forward later into the night, around 9:30, 10 o'clock-ish. I was lying down on my couch reading one of my books when all of a sudden I heard a strange thud sound. It was very quick, but quite loud. It sounded like it came from inside, but I wasn't sure. I thought about it, and I continued reading. Not very long after that, I heard the sound of someone talking, but it was muffled, and I couldn't make out a word they were saying. Where the hell is that coming from? I asked myself, okay, now I knew I wasn't insane. I knew there was someone there. I started to panic, and I had a horrible feeling that strange unknown person came back. I looked around, but the sound stopped completely. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this vicious scream that I have never heard anything like before. Imagine a man was screaming at the top of their lungs as loud as they possibly could in the most demonic yet humanly way possible. Now, my adrenaline was through the roof, practically in overdrive. And then I had a sudden realization, the only thing that came to my mind was the crawl space. I wanted to call the police. But at the same time, I didn't want to end up looking stupid again, so I decided I was going to try and handle it myself. For the time being, I walked outside of my back door and then went around the house because it would have been much easier for me to enter the crawl space from outside rather than from inside. I had actually never seen the inside of the crawl space up until this moment. There was a guy who appeared to be sleeping or pretending to or something. Or maybe he was just on a crap ton of drugs, which, thinking back, I'm sure was the case. I managed to control my frustration, and I didn't say a word to him. I called the police. Immediately, and stepped out of the crawl space area. I waited around for them, and when they showed up, I showed them the man I was talking about. The cops dragged him out of there and sent him to the hospital to be checked out and then to jail. This man had been practically living underneath my house for I don't even know how long. He had a sleeping bag down there, a lantern, and a bunch of food that he had stored away. I was horrified when I found this out, and I couldn't get a good night's sleep for weeks. How the hell did I not notice he was down there all this time? It was a Friday after school. Which video games, pizza, and talking to my friends all night on the phone. I had just got off the bus, and I had the house to myself. My parents were still at work. My mom doesn't usually get home till after 5, along with my dad, usually around 6:30. My older brother wasn't there either. I honestly have no idea where he was, but he was an adult, so he could have been doing anything. As soon as I got home, I jumped right in bed and got into comfy clothes like sweatpants and oversized t-shirt that would be too big for me to wear in public. This was seriously one of the best feelings to me as a kid. Don't get me wrong, I loved school and seeing my friends, but there is just something nice about being home after a long week of school. I went to a Catholic school, so the dress code was very strict. That's why, as soon as I would get home, I liked to change my clothes. Mom would also get upset if I was wearing my school clothes around the house. Anyways, I did my usual routine of taking a shower, relaxing a bit, and eating some snacks while I waited for my friends to get online so we could play video games. My mom got home a little bit earlier than I expected, and she said that her and my dad were going to be going out to some sort of party that was a few hours away. My dad showed up not much later after my mom. As well, I was stoked about them going to a party because that meant I would have the house to myself all night. My parents left for the party around 7 that night. They told me to be safe and they gave me a hug before they left and said that they will be out pretty late. And if anything were to happen, to call our neighbor emergency-wise. Of course, I would call my parents as well, but they wouldn't be much help if they were 2 hours away. We are really close with our neighbors, and we have been for a long time. My parents have known them since before I was born, and we consider them like family. I reassured my mom that everything was going to be okay, and that they deserve to have a nice night out. They both work really hard and have always been great parents. A couple hours after they had been gone, I started to get tired. My plans of staying awake all night and pulling an all-nighter had failed. I was way more tired than usual, and I didn't care to fight sleep. I lied awake in my bed for a little while, texting my friends and scrolling through social media and watching YouTube videos, when all of a sudden I heard a car outside. I jumped up out of bed thinking that it was my mom and dad and that they were finally home. I peeked out the blinds from my window and I rubbed my eyes. I didn't recognize the vehicle at all. Then they pulled into the driveway as soon as they did. The headlights of the car shined right at me, and I very quickly moved my head away from the window. "Who in the heck is at my house right now?" called my mom. But no answer at first. I wondered if maybe my parents had drank too much, so maybe they had someone drive them home. But I thought that was very unlikely, as they weren't big drinkers. I peeked my eye out of the blinds ever so slightly to where I could just barely see outside, all while trying to remain unnoticed. A few seconds after that, the car, their entry, backed out of the driveway and sped off and continued down our street. We live off of a back road in a very small subdivision, and there's only like 3 streets in our entire neighborhood, and my street only has like 8 or 9 houses on it. If you were approaching our house, we are the third to the last house on the right side of our street, and our street has a dead end. I thought that maybe they were just drunk or high and trying to figure out where they were going or something. Oh man, that I couldn't have been further from the truth. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they definitely weren't lost. I found that out. About 20 minutes later, all I could see was that the car drove towards the end of the street, where the dead end met the dark wooded trail. I couldn't see that far, though, from my window or from any of the other windows in the house, and I most definitely wasn't going to step outside to investigate. I realized that things like this may happen from time to time, where someone pulls into your driveway because maybe they need to turn around or get situated, or like 10 other things. That they could be doing, but I had a serious and horrible, gut-wrenching feeling about it. There was never much traffic on our street, and it was late at night, and with me being home alone, I was concerned sure enough time had passed by for me to forget about the car and for me to almost owe off to sleep, when all of a sudden I heard someone yelling in the house. It took me a few minutes to finally realize what was going on, because I was so startled and still half asleep. But someone had broken into our home. I jumped out of bed quicker than I thought was even possible. I swear I could literally hear my own heartbeat thumping. That's how freaked out I was. I had to act fast, and I knew that time was ticking. My only option was to run. I didn't have anything to fend for myself, really, and I had nowhere to hide. Our house is quite small in comparison to your average American-sized home, so I knew it was only a matter of minutes before the intruder would find me vulnerable. But that's if I was lucky. He could step through my bedroom door any second now, and I knew that my mom finally started calling me back, and my phone rang. I didn't answer it because I didn't want to alert the intruder. I was just praying to God that whoever was inside with me didn't hear my phone go off. I ran over to my window and I swung the blinds open and attempted to open my window so I could escape to safety for whatever reason. Though I couldn't get the damn thing to open. I had never opened my window before and it was locked, but I couldn't for the life of me unlock it. No matter how hard I tried to turn the lever, it just wouldn't budge. I knew I was in some serious trouble now. I needed to buy myself some time desperately before the man found me alone. I slid my dresser across the floor and put it in front of the door to act as a barricade, and I was hoping that would be enough to stop him from getting in my room. If he tried, I didn't have a clo in my room, so the only place I could hide was under my bed. I thought that was too obvious, and that would probably be the first place someone would look, but I had no other option. I heard footsteps on the hard wooded floor walking down the hall towards my room, and then a loud and aggressive knock. Following the brief moment of silence, he knocked so hard, and it scared me so much I had to cover my mouth before I let out a desperate scream. Then he started messing with the door handle, trying to get in, but to no avail. He then started speaking to me. "Hey, I know you're in there. How about you just let me inside and make this 10 times easier for me? The both of us, while I was under the bed, I managed to whip my phone out and call the police. To my luck, there was an officer only a mile or two away and he got here in minutes, but still those minutes felt like ages. The man kept screaming at me, telling me to open the door and to let him in. One of the officers finally arrived and made his way inside, along with 3 other policemen that showed up, one by one, right after one another, separated by only a few minutes. The officer made it very clear of his entry and yelled, "Police!" Apparently, the intruder left the door wide open, and that's how the police officer let himself in. Only a few minutes later, the cop found the man who was still standing in my bedroom door and ordered him to get on his knees. The man loomed at the officer, and the cop had no choice but to shoot him. The man was taken to the hospital, and I gave the police my statement. I called my mom, and my parents rushed home. The man ended up surviving the gunshot wound, and he is currently sitting in jail right now awaiting trial. My mom got us the best lawyer around, and we are going to nail his ass to the coffin in court. I hate staying home alone nowadays. I'm sure you can see why. Bringing my boyfriend Sav me from a Craigslist creep a few weeks ago. I had to fly out to a small town that I've never been to in order to look for a place to live. I'm moving there in the fall to start grad school. My boyfriend flew with me, and before the trip I researched all sorts of apartments on Craigslist, and I set up a bunch of appointments. Our first appointment was in the afternoon, in this sort of remote residential area. The landlord sounded fine over email and asked me to call him an hour before the appointment to confirm that I was coming. I called, but he didn't answer, so my boyfriend and I started walking to the house, just hoped that he would show up. Maybe 10 minutes before the appointment. He called me, "Are you coming?" He asked. He sounded like an older man and had this very strange, slow way of talking, but I just thought that he was older. "Yes, we are in front of the house now." He got extremely upset. What do you mean, we? "Oh, yes, my boyfriend's with me." "You never told me you had a boyfriend. You never said that." It had never crossed my mind to have to tell him this information, since my boyfriend would not be coming to live with me. He was just helping me look. For apartments, I told the man so, and after a very long pause, he said, "I'm sorry, it's just sometimes people don't tell me when they are married, and it upsets me. I'll see you soon." Then he hung up. I told my boyfriend about what the man had said, and he was immediately weirded out. He wanted to leave, but there was slim pickings in terms of real estate at this point, so I stupidly said that we had to stay, in case his place was the place. As we are discussing it, we see a man leave the house. We're going to view. This man was young and extremely sketchy, looking greasy hair and furtive eyes. He took one look at us and ran out of the house to his car and pulled away from the curb with a screech. Okay, so now we're really weirded out, but this isn't enough for us to bail just yet. And as we look at each other wondering what to do, the landlord arrives. He's in his 50s and very tall and very strong looking. His eyes are completely blank and empty with warmth or emotion. He slowly walks up to us and says, "I shake your hands, but mine are dirty." "What?" from my boyfriend asks. "Work is the flat reply." He asks us a lot of questions, completely ignoring my boyfriend the entire time. He stares into my eyes without blinking. What am I going to school for? What other places am I considering for living? It's my boyfriend moving to this town too. I try to give answers that are as vague as possible. Meanwhile, my boyfriend asks the landlord questions of the same kind which he refuses to answer. Then he says, "Let me show you the basement." At this point, we should have left, but we didn't. I kept thinking this was an eccentric old man from a small town. We're city folk, and that we were just feeling paranoid. My boyfriend, on the other hand, wanted out of there, but he followed us as the man led us to the back of the house, away from the street, to this sort of detached shed. He opened the door and we saw that there were stairs leading down into the utter darkness. He flipped the switch at the top of the stairs, and the light didn't come on normally. The response for this is, "Oh, the light's out," or something like that. But he just said H and slowly walked down into the darkness. Then he stood there without moving in the dark and said, "Aren't you coming down There's nothing to see if the light's out," says. My boyfriend, the landlord, just stands there for a long time, then slowly walks up the stairs and closes the basement door without saying anything. He took us into the house. Weird and increasingly creepy things ensued the front door. The only exit to the house locked automatically. And when my boyfriend tried to fiddle with it, the man got really upset and told him to leave it alone. He managed to get it open secretly, though the men kept trying to box us into small rooms, according to my boyfriend, also kept reaching his hands into his pockets, only to take them away when he caught us looking on Craigslist. And in person, the man claimed that there was a grad student already living in the house, but the evidence of that seemed arranged. There were neat piles of generic textbooks on the table, but not all other things that a 20-some might read. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, but no other food in the fridge or pantry or utensils. There were maybe 3 t-shirts in the closet. This supposed grad student wasn't out of town, but the landlord couldn't say what school he went to or how long he'd been renting the house. Finally, the man had showed us every single room in the house but one. This one he refused to open, claiming it was just the attic and we didn't need to see anything up there. He gave us several reasons when we inquired. It was unfinished. There was furniture up there. It would smell bad. This last one, I believed, because standing near the door, it smelled terrible. Finally, we made our excuses and bolted out of there. The man walked us out, pretending to go to his car to leave, and when he thought we had turned the corner, slowly sauntered back into the house. My boyfriend Fix headed on the idea that there was something wrong with this guy. Googled the man that night. We found out 3 things: that he was a pillar of the community, known by a lot of the town's people, and that there was no evidence of him owning or managing a real estate company, as he claimed on Craigslist, and that he had listed his home address as the very house we had been touring, the house where a supposed grad student lived. So that was the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me. I was 16 and looking for a new gaming PC to buy on Craigslist. I had just gotten my first job and wanted to treat myself. After my first paycheck, I was online pretty much every day. After work, scrolling through any new listings until one of them looked good. It was a 3-year-old Alienware with some decent specs, listed for only $200. In the description, it said they had recently upgraded to a newer PC and had no use. For this one, but that it still works. Just fine. I sent him an email and he got back to me quickly. We exchanged a few back and forth messages before agreeing to meet up. The next day, he told me to meet him at a specific grocery store parking lot at 8 p.m. It was kind of far, so I suggested somewhere else that we can meet halfway, but he made a bunch of excuses as to why he couldn't. He said he was going to be busy all week and wouldn't be able to drive very far, so if I wanted it, I'd have to pick it up near him. Although finding it a little annoying, I still thought the deal was worth it and agreed to pick it up in the morning. I thought about it some more and almost decided to call it off. But then he sent me a few videos to show that the PC was working, and also said that if there were any issues he would refund me, so it made me feel better about it. I went through with it, driving 35 minutes to the grocery store that he said to meet at. Right as I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a truck in the far back. It was the only car in the whole parking lot, and the grocery store's lights were off. Like it was already closed. I had thought the whole point of meeting at a grocery store was because it was a safe public place, so this was kind of defeating the purpose, having already driven almost 40 minutes. Though I still pulled in and hoped it would go smoothly. I parked by his truck and got out. The man sitting inside leaned over and looked down from his window. He didn't smile or greet me or anything. He just looked down like he was inspecting me, which was a really uncomfortable feeling. Then he got out. He was an older guy, like late 40s or 50s. He had brown hair that was thinning in the front, and just from a quick look at him, you could tell there was something wrong. I stood a few feet away, trying to keep my distance, as he walked around and opened the back door. Inside, I could see the computer sitting on the seat, but not the one closest to us. It was on the other seat further inside the truck. He then pointed into the truck and said, "I could take it out and look at it." His hand was still on the door, and he just watched me, waiting for me to crawl in and grab it. I stood there awkwardly for a second as my eyes moved between him and the truck, before I noticed a small detail. The handle on the inside of the door that he was holding open was missing. It wouldn't take a genius to assume what this was. I started backing away from him and hurried into my car. He yelled at me to come back, but I pulled out right away. The guy rushed into his truck, and instead of following me, he drove off in the other direction. There's absolutely no doubt that if I'd crawled into his back seat, he would have slammed the door behind me with no handle on the inside. It was obvious it was a trap. Unfortunately, all I had was his email to send to the police, but there was no tracing it. I just hope nobody else falls for his disturbing Craigslist scam. I've checked a few times since then to see if his ad was back up for the PC, hoping to set him up with the police or something. So far, I haven't seen anything, but he could just be using a different alias and trying to scam with a different item. My advice is to stay away from Craigslist. I was using Craigslist to find a condo or room in a house to live in for a few months. Most normal apartments only have 1-year leasing terms, but Craigslist was full of private owners renting out their places or rooms. Usually they were cheaper, and the owners were more willing to negotiate on the length of the lease. I had about a month to search, and I found and viewed a few places, but they all backed out last minute. Then I found another one looking about the same as all the others. It was a room for rent in a home. 20 minutes from me, the person listing it was a 22-year-old young guy. After reaching out, we texted back and forth for a few days before booking a time for me to view the room. When I drove out there and got to the street, his address was on. I definitely felt a little less excited. The houses looked like they were barely standing or just not taken care of at all. Lots of yards were overgrown and even had junk in their front lawns. I guess this is what you get when you can't afford anything better. Though I hoped maybe the one I was viewing would be a little more taken care of, but when I parked in the driveway of the home, it looked like all the rest. I still figured I'd give it a shot while I was here, so I got out and pressed the doorbell. It didn't work, so I knocked. Immediately, heavy footsteps came up to the other side of the door. There was a really uncomfortable pause, like maybe a whole 15 seconds. Then he opened it. Just a crack. I could only see half of his face as he asked me my name. I nervously smiled and answered. Then he opened it all the way and welcomed me inside. He was tall and somewhat thin, with shoulder-length hair and some tattoos showing on his neck, but it was obvious that he was not in his 20s. He was at least mid-30s, maybe even older. I was already standing inside the house at this point, though, and he was leading me through the hallway. The man was actually moving really fast, like he was trying to show me everything in a hurry and talking non-stop, which made it hard for me to think too long about anything or realize how odd the situation was. The kitchen was very old and beat up. Some of the cabinets were partially open and loosely hanging on their hinges. He only spent a few seconds in there before moving into the next hallway that had 2 doors in it. He went up to the first and turned to face me. "This one will be your room," he said, opening the door and gesturing to me to have a look. This was when I finally had a moment to catch my breath and think about this. I figured it was probably best just to continue through with the tour since I was already in the home, and then obviously never come back. But as I stood there, having only hesitated for maybe 3 or 4 seconds though, the man suddenly got angry, like his face and whole demeanor instantly changed. He didn't say another word, but started walking toward me. I quickly backed away, to which he matched my pace and started moving quicker in my direction. I turned and sprinted down the hallway. As I left the house, I heard him stop at the front door and slam it shut behind me. I felt so stupid for having even entered the home, after already realizing that things were not adding up. I know technically nothing happened, but everything was pointing to an awful outcome. After that, I was too terrified to even try Craigslist again. I live on the East Coast. There's a lot of homesteads around here, or just in general off-grid cabins and houses. Some of them aren't fully off-grid, but they're just far out and on large properties with 40+ acres of land. It's normal around here to buy used tools and equipment from neighbors or others in the area. At the time, I was doing construction on my property and was in need of a flatbed trailer for my truck so I could haul more materials from the hardware stores. These are absurdly expensive, but since almost everyone around here has them, there's a lot of used ones people want to get rid of. Craigslist was the first and only site that I checked on. There were actually a bunch for sale, and I sent out multiple emails. Only one of them replied, though, and we scheduled a good time for me to stop by, all I really knew. Going into it was that his name was Devin and that he had what I needed. Again, this was a super common thing around here that I'd done a million times before, so I had no worries going into it. I drove about an hour from my place through mostly national forest roads until I made it to his driveway. It was like most around here, just a thin gravel road into the woods I drove through, and up to his house it was a very small and really old-looking wooden cabin with a clearing in the trees leading up to it. The thing that I first noticed, though, was that there was no flatbed trailer on the property. I mean, it's a huge thing. It couldn't just be hiding behind a tree or something, so I expected to see it right when I pulled in. The only thing I could think of was that there must be a garage or shed in the back, that he kept it in. Anyway, I parked in the grass and got out. I stood there for a few seconds to see if he'd come out and meet me, but he didn't. So I walked up to the porch and knocked on the door while waiting. I couldn't tell if any of the lights were on. Inside, the curtains were covering the windows and the sun was still setting, so it was too hard to tell after waiting for a whole minute, though nobody had come to the door and I started to feel like nobody was even home. Then I got a text. It was from Devin saying to come around to the back of the cabin where he had the trailer at. I felt something off about it, but also I did assume that it might be kept in the backyard, so I walked around to at least have a look. When I looked around the corner, all I saw were trees. I walked a bit further, stopping on the side of the cabin just before reaching the back. There wasn't even a clearing behind the cabin. It was just woods going as far as I could see. I had had enough at this point. I started walking back to my truck, but suddenly heard something behind me. I turned and looked at the woods again, not seeing anything. What I heard sounded like someone approaching from just around the corner. I continued walking, quickening my pace, before hearing loud footsteps pushing through the grass behind me. I only caught a small view of the guy charging at me before I booked it for my truck. I don't know if he gave up right away or had something else in mind or what, but when I got in and looked back at the cabin, the guy was gone. I got out of there and drove to the nearest town where I got in contact with the police. The short of it is that the state didn't even know about any cabin built on that land as it was supposed. To be an unoccupied parcel when they investigated it was clearly abandoned, with there obviously being no intent to sell me anything. The guy was definitely setting me up for some kind of harmful intent. My guess is that he was hiding along the back wall of the cabin, waiting to jump me as soon as I came around. Luckily, I knew something was up and didn't walk all the way back there. If I had, who knows where I'd be right now. This was a pretty normal night for me. I was off work for the weekend and was planning on doing absolutely nothing productive for my 2 days off. I had some snacks and drinks set up on the table by my couch, and I was watching some silly movie to pass the time. It was storming outside, and it was actually a lot worse than it usually was around here. The lightning was really loud, like it was touching ground less than a mile away. I usually find comfort in rainy weather, but this was a bit much, even for my taste. What definitely wasn't comforting was when I heard something hit my front door. It was only a single thud, which made me think the wind had blown something into it. I got up and checked outside, opening the door and getting peppered by the rain and wind. Nothing was out there, though, that could have bumped into my door. I was actually so confused that I even stepped further outside to look around for anything near my porch. Not getting any answers and only getting drenched by the rain, I went back inside, whatever it was. It seemed like it was gone. My shirt was completely soaked through. So before doing anything else, I went right upstairs and threw on a clean shirt and dried myself off with a towel. While I was up there, I heard it again, a loud thud slam into the front door. It made me jump and mumble under my breath as I was genuinely shook by it. I waited for any more sounds as I regained my cool, then moved over to the stairs and looked over the railing at the front door. My eyes widened. The door was open, rain splashing inside, and everything. I quickly ran over and shut it as best I could, but the handle was all messed up. I still had no idea what happened. Honestly, I thought there was a tornado or something. Of course, I quickly realized that this was far more horrifying than I thought. The puddle that formed inside the doorway had several muddy shoe prints smeared into it and going across the floor with the door. Loosely sitting in the frame, I left it and started to follow the path of mud and water through the hallway. I don't know why, but for some reason I felt like I was trapped in there with whoever was inside. I know now that I should have just run away immediately. But in the moment, I think the fear and adrenaline had me acting out of character. When I turned around the corner, which led to the family room, a pair of old soaked boots were scattered on the floor, and the shoe prints I was following ended. I looked up. The lights were off in this room, and it only had a small couch and a sofa chair, which I knew they had to be hiding behind one of them. It was only then, as I stared into the pitch-black room, standing only a few feet away from an unknown person, that I realized I needed to get out of there. ASAP, I quickly got my phone from the couch in the living room and ran outside into the storm, then found a tree to stand under as I called 911. It took several minutes, but eventually they came. 4 officers went into my home, and a minute later they came out, dragging a man through the rain and into their car. He looked crazy. I don't know how else to describe him. His hair was long and his eyes were sunken. And what's even more disturbing was that after they locked him up in the car, I went back inside with an officer, and they said they found him hiding under the couch. So that whole time I was staring into the dark room, he was probably staring right back at me. Even worse, we found a sledgehammer behind the couch. He was hiding under. He obviously used it to break in. But what else he was going to do with it is unknown. Hopefully he stays locked up for a long time. Otherwise, I'll probably be living paranoid for the rest of my life. I work for a tech company as a customer support agent on their 24/7 live chat service. Because of the nature of the job, I get to work from home. The downside, though, was that I was an overnight worker, being in the comfort of my own home, and having to pull an all-nighter was a recipe for disaster. This was a regular work night. I had my plug-in open on my laptop that automatically receives new chats. I'd probably get 5 to 10 customers an hour, and each chat usually resolved within 2 minutes. So a lot of my job was just waiting. I kept a hot cup of coffee on my desk and had YouTube open on my other monitor around 2 a.m. Maybe a little earlier, I was helping a customer figure out their refund when I heard so mething outside. It was a man seemingly calling out for someone to help them, help me something. About it sent chills through me as it sounded like they were right outside my house, being in the middle of a chat, though I couldn't get up to check who it was right away. Also, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. I had a bad feeling. I continued to help the customer, hearing this man calling out in the background for several minutes. Help me once I was done. I decided to just look out the window and see what was going on, whoever it was, though I knew that couldn't possibly need help. That bad if they were standing in the same spot. For multiple minutes, I went downstairs, and after hearing them call out again, I realized they were somewhere near the back of my house. I went up to the window and peeked through the blinds. My backyard was fenced in, but standing right in the middle was some guy. He yelled again, but his body didn't move. It looked unnatural as he was standing there, looking as if nothing was wrong. It was really dark, but I could tell he was wearing a hoodie and dark jeans. I figured it was probably best to just leave this guy alone. He was probably drunk or some kind of druggie. I left the window and went back upstairs almost as soon as I left. Though the guy stopped yelling, it kind of creeped me out, like he somehow knew I was there. But I hoped that it just meant he was leaving. A minute later, I got another customer to help. I started typing in my message, and before I could finish, extremely loud knocking suddenly came from downstairs. I could tell from the hollow plastic sound that it came from the back door. I knew it had to be that guy, which now made me nervous. What could he possibly want? Clearly, whatever it was, he wasn't going to leave without it. I quickly finished typing, then picked on my phone and reported the guy to the police. Then I went back downstairs. I looked down the hallway and immediately I could see him standing at the back door. His face was pressed into it as he stared through the door. Right at me, he started hitting the door again, and I wasn't sure what else to do, so I kind of just stood there after maybe 30 seconds. His face fell flat and he backed away. Then he walked through my backyard and climbed the fence as I watched, though thinking this was all over. I could see his figure moving through the gaps in the fence panels. And that's when I noticed several more figures moving outside. The fence police took my account of what happened, and I described Des, the guy, as best I could. I think it was a whole group plotting something. Maybe the one guy was just to get me to open the door and the rest would come after. I really don't know. I just pray this was a random attempt and not something they were specifically going after me for. If that's the case, then that might not be the last I see of them. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, right in the heart of the city. The high crime rate is no exaggeration, as there's new stories coming out every day about awful things living here, though I'd actually never had anything happen to me up until this point and never even seen anything happen. Personally, I always felt like whatever was going on was kind of outside of my life. So I tried to go about life as normal. I worked for both Uber Eats and DoorDash. Usually on my bike, since I was in the city this day, I was doing mostly Uber Eats. And I'd started around dinner time. The weather wasn't great, cloudy and raining off and on. But it's part of the job sometimes, as the money's not going to make itself around 11. I found myself pretty far from my usual location in the middle of the city, with the rain getting worse. I was thinking about just biking back to kind of reset my location closer to home, but an order popped up that was too hard to refuse. $30 for a delivery. 2M away for reference. I was on the edge of the city where it merges into a more suburban area with small homes and large apartment buildings. It wasn't a nice area by any means, but it was nowhere I hadn't been before I rode up to the restaurant and got the bag, then strapped it to my bike. As I was doing this, a car's headlights were lighting up the sidewalk. It was parked a little ways down, and had been there the whole time. I got on my bike and started heading out, and as I did, I saw the headlights move out and continue behind me. Just a coincidence, I assumed. But as I made a few turns and cycled into the neighborhood, that same car was still behind me. After a couple minutes, I made it to the apartment building that the delivery was for. I pulled up to the bike rack and swung my chain around it, and moments later the car pulled into the parking lot. Now I was freaking out a little. Maybe it was still a coincidence, but I was still a bit on edge about them, possibly stealing my bike. I grabbed the order and hurried inside, trying to drop it off quickly. I went up to the second floor and got to the room, then knocked on the door. It was a cash payment, which a lot of people do around here, but was super inconvenient right now. As I waited for them to answer, I looked down the hallway. It was dimly lit, and really run-down paint peeling on the walls, missing ceiling tiles, and even some mold near some of the doors. It was also oddly quiet for such a large building, quiet enough for me to hear a couple people coming up the steps. I knocked on the door again, but kept my eyes fixed on the end of the hallway. I could feel my heart rate rising, like my body knew something was wrong about this. Then two men showed up at the end of the hallway. They were walking toward me, making eye contact, like they were staring me down. The person in the room still didn't open up, but I didn't know what to do. I tried to leave and walk past the two men, but they blocked the whole corridor and pushed me back. Then the door swung open. Another man, clearly with these two, helped force me into their room, slamming and locking the door with me inside. I was screaming for my life. Life at this point, with no idea what was going on. They threatened me and took me into the bedroom, which was completely empty of anything they tossed me in, and locked the door. I sat there in the middle of the small, empty room, and just felt hopeless and terrified. I could hear the three men talking, and they said something about getting both of us into a car. Both of us. I didn't know what that meant. Then there was screaming, not from the men, though it was from police officers yelling for them to open the door. From what it sounded like, the men didn't put up any fight. I was helped out, not too long after, which was when I figured out what both of us meant. There was another victim in one of the other rooms. I guess 10 minutes before I got there, they had done the exact same thing to a different delivery person. They ordered, it followed them and kidnapped them. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called for help, which is why the cops arrived so quickly as far as what was going to happen if nobody showed up. We can't say for certain. None of the men said a word about their intentions, so all the cops can do is assume based on any evidence they could find. Luckily, it seemed like this was their first attempt at something like this, so hopefully it'll be their last. I can't imagine what would have taken place if not for the neighbors saving us. I take the same route every single day, in and out of the city. I don't live very far, just 30 or so minutes out, in the quiet suburbs. The road I took was always quiet at night, which was a huge relief compared to the traffic there was during the day. I was driving on this road, and everything was going just as it always did. It was a little past 1 p.m. I was listening to my music and happy to be almost home when I was 10 minutes away, and entering the woodsy area just before the start of the suburbs. A light beamed from up the road. Nothing was off at first, but as it got closer, it seemed to be really bright. Like almost blinding me, I literally had to stare at the shoulder of the road to make sure I stayed in my lane. But just as I thought they were going to pass me, I suddenly could see a glimpse of their tires, right in my lane. They were driving on the wrong side of the road, about to head on collision with me. My reflexes took over and I swerved to the right, immediately flying off the road and slamming into the ditch that bordered the woods. It took me a few seconds to gather myself, but I didn't seem to be very injured or anything. I unbuckled my seatbelt and jumped out of the car. It was total for sure. The whole front was pretty much ripped off, and it honestly looked like I should have died in there. Then I remembered what happened, and immediately got pissed off. I climbed out of the ditch and looked down the road. I expected to see their headlights fading out in the distance. but I was surprised they had stopped and pulled over not too far down. Before approaching them, I quickly looked at my surroundings and realized how secluded we were. So, before confronting them, I ran back down to my car and got my phone calling the police. I didn't know who was in that car up there, or if they were drunk and angry or something, so I figured I'd play it safe. The operator said they would be here in 5 minutes, so I hung up and started to walk back up the ditch, but was startled by a guy now standing at the top. He didn't ask if I was okay or say anything at all. "Are you the one that made me crash? You could have killed me," I said, trying to hold back my anger until the cops arrived. He still didn't speak, but the light from his car on the road suddenly started getting brighter and coming toward where he was standing. I was still in the ditch, but could see that it was the same car and someone else was driving it. They backed up right to the edge of the ditch. Then the driver door swung open and another guy got out. The two men started talking in a different language. I think it was Russian or German. I'm not good with languages, but it had that aggressive sound to it. As they talked, the one guy rushed around to the back of the car and threw open the trunk, but instead of grabbing anything, he turned to face me. Both of them immediately came running at me down into the ditch. It didn't take me more than a split second to put the pieces together around my car and continued chasing me. They were both large and heavier-looking men, so after a good minute of sprinting, I'd lost them. Now I was in the middle of the woods with absolutely no light to see where I was going. I didn't even know which direction was which. With no sounds of the men nearby, I aimlessly wandered through the trees. I wasn't trying to get back to the road while the men were still around, but I also didn't want to get completely lost so that the police wouldn't be able to help me after only a couple minutes of walking, though I could hear the sirens in the distance to my left. I followed the sound, leading me straight to the road, where I could see the cop car at the top of the ditch and 2 officers inspecting my car. There were no signs of the men anywhere. I explained what happened and they wrote down a report, but the follow-up investigation was minimal since only their description was to go off of nothing was stolen from my car, though it's pretty blatant that they were trying to throw me in their trunk. But whether that was planned before or after the crash is unclear. Maybe they made a mistake and we're trying to cover it up, or it could have all been just as they intended. Hi. I'm writing this today because I love your channel, and I thought it might be a great opportunity to share my story. I have short hair, snake bite piercings, a septum piercing, a nose piercing, and I wear oversized men's clothes, as that's what I'm most comfortable in. I have no problem with people viewing me as masculine, so it was my first day in 11th grade. I was having lunch with my best friend Sally when she gestured to a boy sitting next to us. His name was Henry, and everyone knew him to be the big bully since middle school. Surprisingly, I noticed Henry staring at me with a creepy smile. I never talked to him before, so I felt weird when he smiled at me the rest of the day, wherever I went, and his eyes followed me when the last class bell rang, and it was time to go home. I got a call from my dad saying that he was going to visit my uncle at the hospital battling cancer, meaning I was going to be at home alone. As my mom was at work, my older sister was sleeping over at her boyfriend's house. I got off the bus and began walking home. I live in a small town, so the side roads are almost always empty, but as I was walking past an alleyway, someone grabbed my arm and pulled me over. It was Henry before I could even process what was happening. Henry kissed me. I pushed him away and he screamed, "What, you were smiling at me?" Remember, I thought we shared a moment. I was shocked, realizing how delusional this guy was. I yelled back at him, "No, you're the one who smiled, and FYI, I'm into girls." I saw the anger in his eyes as he just said "fine" in annoyance and stormed off. I took a second to process what just happened before I continued walking home. I didn't share this with my parents and went to bed after watching Walking Dead reruns. I usually sleep with one window open for cross-ventilation around 3 a.m. I heard a quiet noise now. I have a guinea pig, so I'm used to noises, but this one sounded different. I immediately became alarmed and, slowly looking around the room, someone was crawling through the window and entering my bedroom, seeing an intruder. The normal reaction should be screaming, but I was too shaken by this. I laid on the bed, frozen like a mummy, when the man stopped and turned to me. He stood still and watched for a few seconds, but all of a sudden picked up speed and ran right at me before I could scream. He placed his hand on my mouth. Then, when I realized that it was Henry, luckily my dad was still awake downstairs and he saw someone jumping our fence from our living room. He slammed through the door of my room so hard that Henry's face turned pale. He tried to jump out through the window and escape, but my dad grabbed his t-shirt and pulled him back. The police arrested Henry and took him away in handcuffs. I hugged my mom while struggling to hold back my tears. I was so scared, and I didn't know that he wanted or even knew how he knew my address, but I figured that he must have followed me home the next morning. I woke up and called my best friend to tell them about this incident, but she didn't pick up. I wasn't too concerned about it, as she often slept in, so I decided to just get ready for school and wait for her there. The day passed, and she never came, so I tried calling her, but she didn't answer again. I figured that she was still sick and decided to go to her house to see if everything was okay. When I made it to her house, I knocked, but no one answered. Her parents were out on a business trip, and she was supposed to be home alone. I called her again. I could hear her phone ringing inside the house. I tried the door and noticed that the door was unlocked, so I went inside. I called out to her, so she would know that I was there, but there was no response. I walked up the stairs and into her room, and I was mortified by what I saw there. She was lying unconscious on her bed, and someone scribbled this on her wall: "Once she's gone, you'll be all mine." I called my parents, and for a paramedic, Sally was rushed to the hospital. The doctor said that she fainted out of shock. I immediately thought that it had to be Henry who did this, but then I remembered that he was under Paulie custody right now. 2 days later, when Sally was a little bit better, she told the cops that a guy named Zach from school had snuck into her house with a knife and threatened to kill her. His demeanor was that of like a psycho, which terrorized Sally as she fainted. I didn't know what he wanted, but Zach kept saying one thing repeatedly: "I have to do this for my best friend." I promised him Henry. Zach was eventually arrested and put behind bars for being an accomplice of Henry. It was found later that Henry brainwashed Zach and told him to be on board with his plan. Henry wanted me to be his girlfriend, but when I rejected him, he didn't handle the rejection. Well, it's scary to think that Zach was so obsessed about his friendship with Henry that he didn't even think of the consequences before breaking into Sally's house. Sally and I filed for restraining orders against Henry and Zach, because sadly they haven't done enough to stay behind bars forever. But judging their mental condition and evil intentions, I wouldn't be shocked if these two turned out to be terrifying criminals. In the future, my name is John. I'm 23. I work at a 24/7 bar in my town that's known for our pizza and drinks. We don't really have any other food options, but people seem to enjoy it anyway. I never understood why the owners decided they wanted us to deliver pizzas. It's a lot of hassle for probably not that much extra money, but since we didn't really get that many delivery orders, I was always the only driver during the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. On this night, I walked into the place being pretty CRA-ed. There were several large groups, and with deliveries being slow, I was helping out with waiting tables. In the meantime, there were a few deliveries I made maybe once an hour, and at 3 a.m., there was another regular delivery for me to drop off. I grabbed the single pizza and got in my car. The address was 15 minutes away, so I typed it into Google Maps and started driving everything up until this point was completely normal. This was just like any other delivery. And honestly, I was happy to get out of the crowded bar and onto the quiet roads while driving. Though I got caught off guard when my Google Maps suddenly said I'd arrived, I wasn't even in a neighborhood. I pulled over on the curb and tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong, but double-checking everything. This was the address that was on the order. It was for the entrance to a forest preserve or park or something. There weren't even any houses nearby that it could have been mixed up with. So I called the customer's number. It rang for less than a second before they picked up. "Hey, this is John. I'm just trying to deliver your pizza, but I think you've given us the wrong address." There was a strangely long pause as I could hear the guy breathing into the phone before he described my car and said to look to my left. I did as he said and literally saw nothing but a completely pitch-black forest. Then I saw something move. It was him waving his arms in the air to get my attention. He was standing in the forest behind the road. I don't know why he didn't just come onto the side of the road where it was easier to see, or even why he ordered it here. To begin with, I got out and started walking over. It was hard not to notice how eerily quiet it was outside, next to this forest preserve. There were no cars anywhere and no other people. I found it really odd, too, that as I walked up, the guy didn't move, like he didn't meet me halfway. He just stood there and watched me walk across the street and up to the grass just before the edge of the forest where he was at. I stopped halfway through the grass, realizing this was getting really weird. I waved him over to come grab the pizza and pay for it. The guy hesitated, and instead of walking up to me, he looked behind me and on either side, pretty obviously looking for any bystanders. My nerves were really high at this point, which made it hard to think straight. If my mind was clear, I definitely would have just taken off for my car and left before I could come to my senses. The guy started approaching me. He was walking really fast and didn't slow down when he got closer. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The guy grabbed my upper arm and started pulling me back toward the forest. He was clearly trying to be quiet, though not yelling or anything, but instead putting all of his efforts into forcing me back. We struggled back and forth for several seconds before I realized I couldn't break free and started punching. Instead, it only took a few clean shots to his face before he let go, and by then we were only a few feet from the forest. I took off running, looking back only to check if he was following. I saw him get up and run into the forest, but to my horror, two other guys came out from behind the trees. I got in my car and drove straight to the police station that was on the other side of the block. But obviously, the guys had completely run off. By then, I actually went back to work after that, explaining what happened to my boss and asking if he had any info on the guy's order. All he had was a phone number, which was already disconnected, and the first name that was most likely fake. After that, he sent me home early with a free slice of pizza, which wasn't exactly a fair trade. But I wasn't complaining. If I'd been dumb enough to walk up to the forest that night, I probably would have been instantly jumped by all three men with no witnesses. Luckily, my hesitance to approach him made it an easier fight to escape, but it very quickly could have turned into something far, music worse. I'm a terrible long-distance driver. I just wanted to put that out there to begin with, because my inexperience really shows I almost never drive more than 30 minutes at a time, but for work, I had to make a 10-hour drive from my small hometown of Broly, all the way up to San Francisco, where our main office was. I'd been with the company for less than 6 months, working remotely, so this was my first time making this drive. Unfortunately, the way there wasn't through the beautiful California coastal highway either. It takes the lesser-used highway on the opposite edge of the state, going through the empty deserts and smaller cities. For the most part, again, I'd never taken this route before, so this was all new to me. I set out my GPS and started driving at 6 p.m. This would be so that I could hopefully make it right, at check-in time at the hotel, which was 3 p.m. The next day, the first hour of the drive was through my town, and it slowly dwindled down to just a few buildings here and there, and eventually nothing there. Also weren't really any other cars about 3 hours in. I passed the gas station and it reminded me to check on my tank. I looked at the meter and noticed it was getting close to running out actually. It was really close to running out. Driving for this long on a boring empty road made me space out and not pay attention to it. I figured I was good enough to wait until the next gas station though, so for the next 20 minutes, I had my eyes open for any gas station exits, but as every mile passed with no gas station, I started to worry that feeling of dread came over me for being so stupid to have let myself get this low on gas. In the middle of a desert, I could feel my car start to jerk randomly and stutter, so I knew this was really bad, just as I was thinking that my car was going to shut off. At any second, I saw someone's headlights on the side of the road. It looks like a police car monitoring the highway, so with pretty much no choice, I pulled off onto the shoulder and parked a little ways behind them. I was hoping they had a gas canister I could use. I got out and started walking up to their car. It had a spotlight by the driver's side mirror and a light bar on the roof. So from behind it looked exactly like a police car, but as I got closer I wasn't so sure. Either way, I needed help, and by now I assumed they had to have seen me walking up anyway. When I got up to the side of the car, it was clearly a police car, but not one in service, like probably an old one that someone had bought after the police markings and other stuff were removed. When I got up to the window, though nobody was inside, but it didn't look abandoned either. The inside looked relatively clean, and there was even a grocery bag on the passenger seat with what looked like food and snacks in it. Something about this was really off, though. I looked up and out at the surrounding desert. It was really dark, mostly empty, aside from some stray cactus. But it only took me a second to notice something moving out there. They were pretty far from the road, so I couldn't tell what they were doing. But there was definitely a person out there, moving around, knowing this wasn't going to go the way I expected. I was going to go back to my car and try to call 911 or maybe roadside assistance. But the figure suddenly stopped moving and stood still. It was like they had noticed me and were suddenly looking over. I didn't know what to do, so I kind of just stood there. Then the person started rushing toward the road. I took this opportunity to run back to my car. The man must have been full-on sprinting though, because by the time I was in my driver's seat, they were already at the road. They stood by their car and stared at me, and I could now see their face in my headlights. They had short black hair and a black beard with dirt in sand covering their entire body from their shoes all the way up to their face. I couldn't tell if he looked mad or what, but he stood like a deer in headlights as if waiting for me to either drive away or get out. I was too scared to try starting my car, because if it stuttered and he heard that, then he'd know I was stuck. So I sat there and just tried over and over to call 911. By the time I finally got through, the man had gotten in his car, and a minute later he drove away, leaving his headlights off and disappearing down the road. As for afterward, an officer made it 30 minutes later and poured a few gallons of gas in my car. I told them about the man who was acting really suspicious and was out in the desert, but he mostly brushed it off and didn't even check on it. He even joked that he was burying a body out there and acted like it was nothing. I was so shaken up, though, that I didn't put up much of a fight and just continued my drive. It's been a while since this all took place, but I can't stop thinking about what that man was doing out there, or possibly how close I was to discovering something. Christmas Eve dinner at Burger King. Sounds innocent enough, right? Not my first choice, but I had to work late. And being Christmas Eve, it looked to be my best choice. I got finished working at 9 a.m. and had some coupons for Burger King, so that made my decision for me when I got to Burger King. I noticed it was still open. but the dining room was shut down. The only way I could get something was if I went through the drive-thru. But the only problem is I don't have a car. I tried to walk up to the drive-thru and place my order, but the compassionate young lady working the drive-thru wasn't having it. She told me if I didn't have a vehicle, I could not use the drive-thru. I became rather aggravated and began saying things that I was not proud of. At this moment, an older woman wearing shining armor appeared on the scene and offered me to jump in her car and order my food. At first, I turned her down, not wanting to be a bother, but after some convincing, I decided to accept her help. After ordering my food, it took so long to get it that I missed my bus and got upset. The nice woman offered me a ride home, and I felt kind of off-put by the offer and declined. She was persistent, but at the same time friendly, and convinced me to take her offer. Mind you, I am a 250-pound 30-some man, so I didn't really feel that threatened by a 50s-something woman. If the circumstances were different, I would not have taken the ride after I told her where I lived. We proceeded home about 5 minutes from my house. He made a wrong turn. I explained that I lived the other way and that we needed to turn around or let me out here, and I would walk the rest of the way. It was then that the woman's demeanor changed, and she told me that she could not let me spend Christmas Eve alone and that she was taking me to her house. I told her that I needed to get home immediately to let my dog out and that I would be fine. The woman then tried to entice me with cocaine and liquor at her place, but since I'm in recovery, I told her I wasn't interested. She refused to turn around or let me out and started to drive, strangely not stopping at stop sign. I'm not going to lie. My mind was racing and I began to sweat. I knew that I could physically overpower this woman, but what awaited me at her house? I also felt terrible about hurting her after all her kindness, but I had to get away before her house, and I didn't know where that was, so I didn't know how much time I had. Then, all of a sudden, luckily, the car in front was stopped at a stop sign, and across from it, another was also stopped. She had to slow down to almost a stop at this point, and this is where I made my break. I jumped out with the car still moving, leaving my food behind, and started walking away. As I was walking away, she stopped and got out of her car and began to try to talk me into getting back into the car with her. That just wasn't an option. I don't know what her motives were or who she was, but I knew I wasn't willing to risk my life over it. I ran all the way home and made sure I wasn't followed. What would have happened to me if it was 2 years earlier, and I was still drinking and doing substances, her offer of booze would have probably worked being a man. The thought of the vulnerability most women face every day was so foreign to me. And now I understand the fear most women face. I really feel this nice woman, a nefarious purpose, and that I just so happen to be the perfect victim of Oppert. Unity, my mind raises. Wouldn't the use of such a non-threatening bait just be perfect to lower the guard of a prospective victim? I never went to the cops because I felt they might not believe me and dismiss my account due to skepticism or paranoia. And I had no proof. But then I wondered, should I have reported it? What if others got hurt? Because I didn't. I'm left hoping my choice hasn't caused harm to anyone. I'm a 29-year-old female, and this happened to me when I was 14. My brother and I went to hang out in the mall with his friends. On a weekend, I was the only girl in a boys' group, so I mostly stayed on my phone. I am very introverted as well. I was getting bored and feeling somewhat ignored, so I told my brother if you could drop me home. He told me he'll leave after some time since we lived far away from the mall. I had to wait for my brother, but at the same time I was so angry with him that I cut off from the group and started roaming around on my own. I was checking some stores while casually walking through when I made eye contact with a man. He seemed to be in his late 40s. He quickly walked up to me and asked, "Are you alone here as much as I've had creepy guys hitting on me?" His eerie tone just added to that experience. I politely said, "No, I'm with my friends," and started to walk away. He started walking with me, but seems like your friends bailed on you. Pretty girl, I groaned and replied, "Yeah, that's why I'm on my own." Well, people can be jerks, but that shouldn't limit us from having fun. He smiled big while saying this. Now, before you judge me, please keep in mind that I was only 14 and really mad at my brother for ruining my weekend. I asked him if he knew anything fun to do around the mall, and he said there's a newly opened gaming zone. I looked at the food, court far away, where I could see my brother laughing and having a good time with his friends. I whispered a hole and then agreed to go to the gaming zone with that man. It was my first time in that mall, so when he said we'd need to go to the basement, as that's where the gaming zone is, I believed him. I really wish I hadn't. We got into the elevator with a bunch of other people. I'm sure they thought the man to be my guardian. So no one bothered that a 14-year-old was following a stranger to the mall basement. One by one, everyone got off, and on the ground floor, the elevator was empty. The man pressed the button to the basement, and we came down to the parking lot. The moment I got off the elevator, my heart skipped a beat. Are you sure there's a gaming zone here?" I asked him. He smiled even bigger and said that the place was under construction, but he had the key to the virtual car racing machine. I nodded, not knowing how deep I was drowning in his lies. He started walking into the dimly lit basement, and I began following him, not knowing what I should do. I thought to text my brother, but there was no network in the basement as well. Now the man started saying how I would enjoy the racing game since there'd be no one to disturb me. Soon, his words started to sound alarming, with creepy double meanings hidden in them as he said, "The car racing machine is so big, and I'll enjoy it riding for hours." Yeah, exactly. That's what he said. We were almost halfway into the basement, and I was constantly looking back to notice how far the elevator was getting from me. A bubbling feeling that something was very wrong suddenly kicked into my stomach, and I stopped saying, my brother just texted me. Looks like I'll have to come some other time. See you later, mister." I quickly turned around and started walking back to the elevator. I was walking fast, but also couldn't run, because I didn't want to give him the idea that I'd panicked. Suddenly, I heard footsteps rushing towards me, and looking back, I saw him running at me full speed. His face was filled with rage and anger as he yelled at me to stop. That's when I made a run for the elevator. I almost bumped into the closed elevator door and started pressing the button. Like crazy, "Please come down before he gets me." I remember praying this to God. The man was inches away when the elevator door opened and my brother with his 3 friends stood inside. "What the hell are you doing here? Jimmy said he saw you with some man in the elevator. What's going on?" My brother sounded really worried, and I glanced back to point at that creepy dude, but he was nowhere to be found. I'm sure he took off realizing my brother had come to get me. I told my brother about this man, and he took me to the mall security to inform them about this shady old guy. I just hope he's not lurking there looking for some underage kid to take them to the basement to try his made-up gaming machine. I never thought much of getting randomly paired with a college roommate. I figured we'd be friendly, share some laughs, and maybe argue over something small, but nothing out of the ordinary. But when I moved into the dorm, I was paired with a girl named Emily, and from the start, things felt off. Emily was quiet, not in a shy way, but in a way that made you wonder if she had something to hide. She didn't go out much, and when she did, she'd be back in no time. She kept to herself and barely spoke to me. I tried to be friendly, but she only gave short one-word answers. Over time, I started to avoid her as much as possible. I felt bad about it, but it was just easier that way. One evening, I was studying in our room when Emily came in looking more upset than usual. She threw her bag on the bed and sat down heavily. I tried to ignore her, but she was pacing back and forth. "You okay?" I asked, though I didn't really expect an answer. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," she said. Then she fell silent again that night. As I was about to fall asleep, I heard Emily's bed creaking. I looked at the clock. It was past 2 a.m. I tried to ignore it, thinking she was just restless. But then I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping sound. It was irregular, like something heavy was being moved around. Curiosity got the better of me. I got up and peeked out of my bed. Emily's bed was moving slightly with each thumb, and I saw her silhouette through the thin partition that separated our beds. She was sitting up, her head bent forward. I was too tired and scared to investigate further, so I just went back to bed the next morning. Emily was already gone when I woke up. I didn't think much of it until the day after I was sitting at my desk, when I noticed something odd. The drawer of the nightstand next to Emily's bed was slightly open, and I could see a piece of paper sticking out. I pulled it out and found a list of names and dates written in Emily's handwriting. It didn't make sense at first, but then I realized they were names of students in our dorm, and the dates were all recent. I started to feel uneasy. I didn't know why Emily would have a list like this, and I didn't want to confront her about it. A few days later, the list was gone, and Emily acted like nothing had happened. As the days went on, Emily started acting even weirder than normal. I started noticing that Emily was always home, even when she said she'd be out. I'd come back from class and her door would be closed, but I could hear her muffled noises from inside. It sounded like she was talking or maybe arguing with someone, but I never saw anyone else come or go one night after several days of this strange behavior. I was coming back from a late study session. As I approached our room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I could hear Emily's voice, but this time it was clear she was talking loudly and angrily. Her door was cracked open, and I could see her in the room. She was standing by the window, her back to me. She was talking to herself, but the way she was moving, it was like she was addressing someone else. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it sounded intense. I didn't want to intrude too much, so I quietly closed the door and went into the common area. The next morning, Emily was gone again. I took the opportunity to look around her side of the room. I felt a little guilty about snooping, but she was acting so weird lately that I wanted to see if I could get a clue as to what was going on. I didn't find much, just a few personal items, and the empty drawer where the list had been. But there was something else underneath her bed. I found a small, old-fashioned key. It didn't look like it belonged to any of the dorm rooms. I put it back where I found it and decided to stay away from her side of the room. Days went by, and Emily's behavior grew even more erratic. One evening, as I was studying late, I saw her from the corner of my eye walking around the dorm, with that strange, intense look on her face. She had a heavy bag with her, and she seemed to be looking for something or someone. I tried to avoid her, but she noticed me and gave me a cold stare. Before quickly disappearing down the hallway, things reached a tipping point. One night, I was awoken by a loud banging sound coming from Emily's side of the room. I hesitated, but decided to check it out. When I opened the door, the room was dark and Emily was nowhere to be seen. Her bed was a mess, and the room looked like it had been ransacked. I went to the common area and saw Emily sitting alone, her head in her hands. She looked up when I approached and had tears in her eyes. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to be supportive. Despite my own fear, she nodded but didn't say anything, so I decided not to press further. The next day, Emily was gone. Her things were packed up and a note was left on her desk saying she was leaving for personal reasons and wouldn't be coming back. I never saw Emily again, and I later found out that she had transferred out of the college. I still don't know what was going on with her, but the whole experience left me shaken. I learned to be more careful about who I lived with and trust my instincts. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever know the real story behind Emily's strange behavior, and that unsettling list of names. Everything about the girl just seemed very strange and mysterious. This happened several years ago. During this time, I really needed some extra money. I was still in school and didn't have a lot of time to work at my part-time job. So I went on Craigslist one time in particular and just browsed around to see what the jobs looked like. I'd only gone on Craigslist a few times before, but I had heard you could do odd jobs for money. I didn't even go on that night with full intentions of finding work. I was just there to kind of look around. However, not long into looking, I noticed this one job that seemed interesting. It was to help a guy move. He said that he was moving that weekend and needed somebody to help him out. The guy said he lived alone and we need to have somebody help him load up a moving vehicle and drive it to his new house. The drive was roughly 30 minutes and the pay for the thing was really good. I think it was like $300. It said it would only take a few hours. Also, so I decided to contact the guy right then and there, and the next day he responded saying that I could have the job. The guy's name was Rob. I was given his address and told to go there on the day at about 5 p.m. So when the time came, I drove to the address. It was a pretty typical house and what appeared to be an average residential neighborhood. Rob lived near the end of a cul-de-sac. There were two smaller moving trucks parked on the side of the street. Out front, I parked my car across the street and a little ways down. Then I texted Rob that I was there. He told me to come inside and I entered his house to see pretty much everything packed up in boxes. We spent the next few hours loading up both of the moving trucks. It was a lot of work. It took us about 1 to 2 hours just to load up the trucks. When we were done with that, Rob gave me the keys to one of the trucks and he told me to follow him. We both then left and headed to his new house. I had no idea where his new house was. I just knew that it was about 30 minutes away. Rob had told me that his car was already at his new place and he would give me a ride back to my car when we were done. Overall, Rob seemed like a pretty average guy. We didn't really talk that much when moving. Mostly we had just been working. So I followed him and we went to this area that I personally had never been to before. But it wasn't far from some places that I did know. It was a quiet and more rural area. I remember we were on this really quiet dirt road with wild land and woods on both sides. Then finally, he pulled into this really long driveway. There was a house and it was a much larger property than his last place. We parked the trucks and then unloaded everything into his house. By the time we were finally done, it was like 9 o'clock at night. After being done, Rob started to act strange. We were clearly done, and I said that I should be getting back now, but Rob just sat down on one of the chairs in his house and told me to sit down and hang out. I figured he was just trying to be nice. So I did. But after like 30 minutes of us sitting there, occasionally talking and watching the TV that was on in the room, I really wanted to go. I said again that I needed to leave. Now, Rob just ignored it when I said it. So I stood up and I asked if he could give me a ride back to my car. Now, Rob then asked if I wanted him to pay me, and he claimed he forgot. I said yes, and then he got up and actually did pay me the $300. But then he went back and sat down. I sat back down and Rob was starting to give me the creeps. He was clearly trying to ignore giving me a ride back. So I took out my phone and I texted a friend who lived somewhat close to that area. Luckily, he was still up, and I asked him to come by and gave him the address. I didn't want to just leave Rob's place because he lived on a quiet dirt road and I wouldn't be able to walk anywhere. My friend said he could come and pick me up. Rob just sat there watching TV for the next 20 minutes or so. It was really awkward, to say the least. I really didn't know what was going on. Finally, I got a text from my friend saying that he was there, and he was parked out front on the side of the road. I stood up and I said to Rob that I had to go, once more. Rob completely ignored it. Then I just started walking to the front of the house. When I walked away, Rob finally asked me what I was doing. I said I was leaving, and I told him, "Bye." Rob then got up and began walking after me. I walked faster and made it to the front door, and as soon as I was out, sprinted down the driveway. I got to my friend in the car and went inside. We then left. I told my friend the crazy story as we drove off. But when we were still going through the quiet neighborhood roads, I noticed headlights behind us. When we turned, the car behind us did as well. I realized that this might be Rob as we continued back towards where my car was. At Rob's other house, he kept following us. At least, I thought it was him. I couldn't see inside of his car with it being nighttime, but I was sure that it was him. My friend decided to make a few random turns to test it out, and sure enough, the car behind us did the same thing. We realized that we should drive to a police station, and we did exactly that. When we did, the car followed us. All the way there, however, it did not go into the parking lot, but turned away. We stayed there for a while, then finally my friend drove me the rest of the way to my car. When we saw my car, though, there was another car parked right behind it. It was the same one that had been following us. It had to be robbed, and he was still inside of his vehicle. We didn't know what to do. My friend ended up calling the police. We were parked on the side of the road, a little ways away. Rob's car was like right behind mine, so close that it was almost touching. We told the police the whole story. They sent out someone to the address and we waited. Rob just stayed there in his car the whole time. We could kind of see him. Not real good. We could tell he was in the car. Finally, the police got there, they talked to Rob, and eventually he went inside of his house. I was able to drive home and my friend did as well. After that, I haven't seen or heard from Rob since. It was such a crazy experience. I'm really grateful to my friend for helping me out. I don't know what I would have done without him there. Years ago, I was driving down the street one night. I was on my way home after working pretty late. By this time, most of the roads were quiet. I had left the highway and was on more local roads. However, I still had about 15 minutes of driving left before I would get back to my apartment. As I was driving down the road, there was mostly woods on both sides. At this point, I remember that I was approaching a stop sign and saw somebody standing on the side of the road nearby. It was a man, and he had a small backpack with him. It appeared as though he was hitchhiking. This was really strange to see. I had never seen anybody hitchhiking in this area before. Plus, hitchhiking in general has not been very popular in a long time. It can be obviously pretty dangerous for everybody involved. When I came to a stop at the stop sign, the man looked right at me and waved as if to ask me to let him in. After briefly stopping, I accelerated through the quiet intersection and kept going. The man remained standing by the stop sign. I continued with my drive down the road. However, I got about a minute down the road, and after a gradual turn in the road, it became very straight. That's when I saw a bunch of brake lights up ahead. They appeared to be a traffic jam. Cars were stopped on the road for almost as far as I could see. I had no idea why. I thought maybe there was a crash or something for this many cars to be backed up. People must have been waiting for a while, though, because it was late at night. So I slowed down, and eventually I came to a complete stop behind the car, in front of me. I really didn't know what exactly was going on after stopping. I waited, and the traffic did not move at all. I remember that after a few minutes, I actually put my car into park. I rolled down both of my windows to get a breeze of fresh air because it was a nice, cool night. I then went on my phone to look up what was going on and maybe find an alternate route. This had been the only way that I had gone home from work, and I didn't know anything else. There weren't a ton of roads out in this area. I couldn't really find anything about it online at the moment, though. And looking ahead, all that I could really see was just brake lights of other cars. So I continued to sit there, stopped, and I started looking for an alternate route. But suddenly, out of nowhere, I heard this noise to my right. As soon as I looked up, I saw somebody at my passenger side window. It was a man. He instantly climbed inside the window, and the next thing I knew, he was in my passenger seat. It happened so fast that I never had a chance to put the window up, and the guy was not that large, so he was able to make it in easily. After getting inside, I realized that it was the same man that I had seen hitchhiking just minutes earlier after he got in my car. I asked him what he was doing. The guy said that he really needed a ride. I told him to get out of my car, and he said no. The guy claimed that he just wanted to go a couple of towns over. I told him again to leave my car. The man did not answer me. I didn't know what to do, to be honest. I wanted to get out of my car and run away, but I did not do that. I told the man that I was going to call the police, and the guy instantly snapped back, saying that he wouldn't let me do that. What exactly that meant, I did not know. The guy moved a little closer to me. I just pushed the horn at that point and did not take my hand off it. The man told me to stop, but I didn't. After a few seconds, some other people nearby started honking as well, probably because they were annoyed at me. The man reached over and tried grabbing my arm. I screamed for help, and my windows were open, so people had to have heard me. At that point, I could not believe it. But the man finally left. He opened up the passenger's door and leaped out. Then he ran off, disappearing into the woods that was next to the road after. That someone actually got out of their car and were approaching me, I told them what happened and let them know that I was not honking just to be annoying. Eventually, traffic started moving. It probably took about 15 minutes. I did not see the guy at all. It turned out that the traffic jam was caused by a traffic light which had fallen over. I'm not sure if somebody crashed into it or what, but I'm glad that we got moving again. I still can't believe that the guy just jumped in my car. Like that, he must have seen the open window. It was one of the scariest moments of my life when I was younger. I rented a room and lived there for a little while. I didn't have much money and was trying to save up for a nicer place. The only place I could really afford in that city was this room. It was an attic in this older house. The house had 4 bedrooms and then an attic as well. There were 2 people living in the house as roommates. Then there was me living in the attic. It was kind of weird because I didn't know the people before moving in. I also wasn't really friends with them. When I lived there, I would have to walk up the stairs and sometimes see them to get into my attic. But once inside in the attic it was basically like a really large room. There was a bathroom attached. And then this tiny kitchen area in the corner. I'd never lived in an attic before, but I didn't mind it too much. The neighborhood seemed nice as well, and it was the typical suburbs with lots of houses nearby. Well, one night I was fast asleep. Sleep only to be awoken sometime in the middle of the night. After turning over in bed and closing my eyes to go back to sleep, I heard a noise. It sounded like something had hit my window. This seemed odd. Even though I was half asleep, I knew that my window was not next to a tree branch or something that would strike it, and it was too high up for somebody to knock on it. I listened, and then, less than a minute later, I heard it. Again, this time I decided to get up. I walked over and looked out of the window. When I did, I saw this man standing outside. He was in our front yard and next to a tree. I did not recognize him, but I also couldn't see him very well. With it being nighttime, the man then appeared to throw something at me. It was a rock, and it struck the window. Luckily, the rock was not very large, and it didn't break the window. I kept watching, and the man soon tossed another one. This one didn't hit the window, but it hit the roof nearby. I had no idea who this guy was or what he was doing. I was hoping and thinking that maybe some neighbor just got really drunk and was being reckless. I couldn't think of why anybody would want to throw rocks at me. As I continued looking out the window, the man suddenly turned and ran off down the street. Then I just covered up the window with the shades, and then went back to bed and went back to sleep. The next day, I happened to see my roommates when I was leaving, and I asked them if they had seen the guy or heard him. Neither of them had, and I guess they slept through it. So anyways, that very same night, the guy was back once more. I was awoken to a small rock being thrown at my window. I woke up and looked out again to see the guy was back this time. I looked at the clock, and it was sometime after 2 in the morning. The man stood there facing me outside from the yard again. After a few moments, he fired another rock in my direction. I was seriously considering calling the police at that point. In fact, I got out my phone and was about to dial, but then the man turned and ran off into the night. Now, looking back, I should have still called and reported it, but I figured that the guy was gone now, and they wouldn't be able to catch him, so nothing really could be done. So then I just went back to bed. I tried to make sense of it and figure out why a guy would be throwing rocks at my window. I couldn't think of anything though, so the next day I went to work as usual, but I happened to be out late that night. I went out with some friends and drove back home at like midnight. At the house, I was renting the attic in. We did not have a driveway and just parked our cars on the side of the street. So after getting back and pulling over, I got out of my car. But then I noticed that there was somebody standing randomly in our front yard. It was not any of my roommates. I realized it was the same guy when I noticed that I had a really bad feeling, but I was already out of my car and walking towards the yard. Now I didn't want to turn around and go back. There was a ways to my right and not blocking me or anything. So I was hoping that I would be able to just walk right past him. I walked quickly, and when I approached the front step, I could sense that the man was now walking after me. I quickly made it inside and then locked the door behind me. I wondered what on earth the guy was doing now. This time, though, I called the police, right then and there. Then I went up into my attic. I looked outside from my window, but could not locate the man. When the police got there, I remember seeing them eerie. At that point, I saw a man come out from behind a tree and attempt to run away. However, he was quickly caught by the police. They determined that he was the same individual that had been throwing rocks at my window. I never found out why he was doing that. Though I'm just glad that after that it stopped. This happened when I had just recently started renting a new house. Well, the house itself was not new, but it was new to me. I had moved to that city for my job and needed a place to live. So I was going month to month in this rental place. It was a pretty standard house for the most part. It had 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a basement, which was unfinished. Not long into living there, I started noticing sort of strange noises at night. I would be in bed and trying to fall asleep and think that I heard some things from downstairs. I couldn't really tell what the noises were, though. At first, it made me nervous that somebody was in my house, but I quickly chalked it up to just a house making noises. Maybe it was the heaters, or maybe it was just old house noises because of where I was in my bedroom, with the door closed. I never heard them that clearly. One night, though, I heard something that seemed louder, so much so that it caused me to get up and out of bed. I decided to go downstairs and look around. When I did so, though I didn't see anything unusual and I heard no more noises, I figured that it was just the old house. I hadn't lived in a house like that, so I didn't really know what to expect with everything. I mean, I'd come from living with roommates or a big family my entire life and never exactly had a really quiet house. So for a few more nights, I just ignored the sounds that I heard. But then another night, things seemed particularly loud again. I just wasn't buying that. It was just the house or the heating system or whatever. I once more got out of bed and went downstairs to investigate. After looking around, I thought that I heard a noise in the basement. I decided to go down there. Now I know that there was some things down there that could possibly make noises. There were several pipes hanging around and stuff. The water heater and other things were also down there, but the noise that I heard coming from there didn't really sound like any of that. It sounded like possibly a person was there, so I walked over and opened up the door to go down into the basement. When I did, I saw that it was very dark down there, but I also heard a noise and was sure that it was a person. I stopped unsure if I should continue. However, these noises stopped after a short time, then it was just silence. I slowly walked down the stairs and I called out, asking if anybody was there, but I got no response when I made it into the basement. I did not see anyone and I didn't hear anything at all, either. I turned on the only dim light that was down there. It didn't illuminate much, but it was better than nothing. I also turned on the flashlight on my phone to see better as well. The basement really wasn't all that big. However, when I got to one corner, I noticed something. There was an old box that had been there since I moved in. It looked like there was something behind the box. When I moved it, I saw a sleeping bag and a few water bottles. They certainly were not there the last time I had been down there. It made me realize that somebody had, in fact, been down there and it looked like they had been living there. I got so freaked out that I ran back upstairs and called 911 immediately. The police came out and looked through my entire house. Nobody was there after searching the property, though they made an interesting discovery. My basement was mostly all underground, but there were windows towards the top of the basement, which would be at the bottom of the ground, leading to outside. One of the windows was extremely easy to open. It was in a garden area in the backyard. It was easy to open from the outside or the inside, and that must have been how the person was coming and going. I had the window replaced the very next day. After that, the person did not return. It really freaks me out knowing that I was living with somebody in my basement for possibly like a week. I'm glad that I never saw them, or I really would have flipped out late last year. I had my 21st birthday along with celebrating with my friends. My boyfriend's mom wanted to take me out as well. So his mom went ahead and reserved a table at a barn downtown for Saturday night. Saturday night comes and there's major traffic, but it's always packed in downtown on the weekend, so this is expected. His mom and I park in a tall parking lot, and we have to walk about 5 blocks to the bar, where we are going to meet my boyfriend and everyone else. So we start walking and arrive at a crosswalk. We have to wait there's maybe 8 other people standing at this crosswalk with us. I'm just patiently standing there minding my own business, when suddenly I know this girl standing next to me. She startled me, to be honest. 1, because of how she seemed to appear out of thin air, and 2, because of how close she was standing next to me. It almost felt as if she was trying to huddle into me, like, you know when a little kid is shot and will try to hide behind his or her parent. Yeah, that's exactly how she was, except she was just leaning into me and she had her shoulders hunched over her hair, was black and long, at least down to her waist. She had on a long striped dress that went down to her ankles, a leather jacket and sandals. She looked to be around my age, but she had dark tan skin and black eyes. Her attire was normal, but she didn't act normal. She was being really weird and kept plugging her nose as if she was smelling something bad, and she kept skittishly looking around as if she expected something to pop out and grab her. To be honest, she was acting like a scared animal, but her demeanor was cold. Her eyes felt like they were dead and empty, and her face held no emotion. So not liking how close she got to me, I took a few steps to the side and guess what? She stepped towards me and got as close as she was. The first time I sort of thought that was weird, but gave the situation the benefit of the doubt. Plus the crosswalk light turned green right after she came close to me, so I figured I didn't have to deal with her because we would walk our separate ways, right? She walked across the street and first few blocks with me, staying the same closeness she was at. No matter where I moved to, no matter how many times she almost got lost in the crowd of people, she would scurry up right next to me again, all the while plugging her nose and looking around everywhere. She made me feel weird. My boyfriend's mom at this point confronted the girl saying, "Hey, do you need anything? Are you okay or what?" To which the girl responded, "It's not safe." After she said that, she slowly lifted her head, cocked her head slightly, and looked me dead in the eyes. Her mouth quivered. My boyfriend's mom and I just looked at each other like, what? At that point, I just wanted to get away from this weirdo. It was bad enough that she wouldn't stop invading my space and following me, but now she's saying this weird ass. While looking at me, my boyfriend's mom pulls me over to her and whispers to me in my ear, "Walk faster and don't look at her." I don't want to see if she's following us, so that's exactly what I do. And guess what? She still follows us all the way to the bar, despite my boyfriend's mom telling her to please stop getting so close to us. She responded with, "I just want to stay with you guys," despite taking unnecessary turns to see if she would turn to follow us. I was freaking out internally. All the way there, we finally get to the bar and whip out our IDs as quickly as we can, so we can get inside and away from the freak following us. You guys, she followed us inside and sat at our table, but she sits at the furthest side of the table. These are real pictures, by the way, and she starts to scoot herself over, but she only moves over when we look away. You turn your head and boom, she's managed to hop one seat closer to you, and she's just staring the whole time with this blank expression on her face. My boyfriend's mom is hated at this point and gets up to tell the bodyguard to make the girl leave. The bodyguard comes and tells the girl that she has to go, and she actually starts to argue with him. I didn't catch the whole conversation over the loud music, but I caught the girl asking him why she had to leave and saying that she can sit anywhere she wanted to. She began to get really aggressive once he told her that the seat was reserved for us and our group that she was not a part of. Of course, she got all fussy and looked at me with malice before she got up and stormed out, but she didn't leave right away. She stood outside looking in at me through the open patio at the front of the bar. She wasn't moving and seemed to care less about the hustle and bustle of the people around her. She stood there for about 15 minutes before finally leaving to God knows where. There was just this really bad and dark feeling that I got from her. She made me really nervous for some reason, and she just felt wrong. I mean, she was probably someone just cracked out on drugs, but it was still super creepy, and I hope I never see her again. Legit. Only 3 people know this story because I don't talk about it. The events happened 13 years ago, and it still messes with me to this day, even though I'm not in any sort of danger anymore. When I was in college, I got super depressed and stressed out. Near my junior year, I was always super into school and just started slipping near the end of my college term, so it threw me off bad. I never experienced failing at subs before, and it threw me into a ridiculous amount of stress. I gradually waited and figured everything would go away with that, but I found myself still feeling very mentally foggy. My sister knew how bad off I was from the last few years of school, so she had it to plan to surprise me. I always wanted to go to Miami growing up. I know how lame that sounds, but being a girl who grew up in the Midwest and even went to college there, it was always super exciting. Looking to me up to this point, I traveled but never went anywhere. As lively or big as Miami always seemed, my sister planned a 5-night vacation with me as a way to get me out of this mental fog and to also celebrate in our own way. Me graduating college, I was very excited. The few months passed and it was time for the trip we get there, and the first few nights were incredible. We H up the restaurants I had on my little list of places to try and spent so many hours by the ocean. I was never a big party girl up to this point in my life. I had been drunk maybe twice. My sister was the opposite, who was at every party that happened in our hometown. She got bored of going back to the room so early every night and convinced me to go to a nightclub with her. For the first time, I fought it for a little bit, but let my guard down because I was feeling great for the first time in a long time, and I was ready to try new things. It was a Saturday night, downtown in the middle of summer. We get to this nightclub and the line is legit wrapped around the building. It was massive. We waited in line for what felt like forever, and we're let in. Finally, I walked in the door and felt like I got shot. Because of loudness, my sister dragged me to the bar and ordered some shot, some drink with a funny name. Again, I decided to just let my guard down and try new things. As more shots went down, I decided that would be the theme of the night, trying new stuff out. I was aware of how boring I was, and was, in my opinion, in the most exciting place in the world around 45 minutes into dancing and drinking. I became very drunk, borderline blackout. I was very sloppy drunk, and I was aware of it. I found myself laying on a couch in the upstairs area overlooking the dance floor as my sister was dancing with some guys. As I lay there trying to consciously sober myself up, I realized how badly I had to pee, so I brought myself up to a sitting position on the couch to stand up and walk to the nearby bathroom. As I sat up, a massive man quickly sat so close to me I could feel his leather pants pressed on my leg. He was huge, definitely over 6 tall, and looked like some sort of bodybuilder. Admittedly, he was very good looking, but I was so drunk that I wasn't even trying to flirt. I just wanted to get up to find the bathroom. He smiled at me and yelled over the music, something like leaving. So soon, I remember nervously laughing and attempted to get back up, but he grabbed onto my dress and pulled me back down to a sitting position next to him. His smile went away and he said in a very deep tone, "I don't remember telling you that you were allowed to leave even though I was very drunk." Leading up to this, I felt like I sobered up within seconds. I had never had anything like this happen before, but I wasn't just going to allow this guy, no matter how much bigger than me he is, do that to me. I attempted to stand up again, and he did the exact same thing, but much more aggressive. I thought it was insanely rude, but I wasn't afraid because of how many people were around me. He tapped my heels with his big yellow leather boots and said I couldn't help but notice how sexy your feet are. My Phi ORF flight kicked in. I slapped him in the face and stood up to walk away. I was very uncomfortable, but I still wasn't afraid, just because the amount of people were around. As I was walking away, I heard him laughing and he yelled to me, "I'm trying to decide if I want to keep your feet after I cut the rest of your body up into little pieces." I still hear that, in my mind, play out clear as "stay." I walked away very quickly as I attempted to search for my sister on the dance floor. From above, I couldn't find her, so I decided to take my phone out to text her, to just see if I'd missed a call from her. I was out of eyeshot from this dude and cut away into the bathroom so I could call her back. It was still pretty loud in there, but it wasn't loud enough to where she couldn't hear me on the phone. I went into a stall and called her back. As I was in the stall, I heard the bathroom door open, and someone went into the one directly next to me. I was waiting for her to pick up when I looked down underneath the stall and saw the same guy's very distinct yellow leather boots. He was just standing there. I felt like I was about to die. I knew he knew I was in there. I held my breath and hung up the phone, just staring at his shoes, not moving a single bit from when he shut the door. I heard the main bathroom door open again, and I immediately ran out the stall, out the door, and straight to outside the club, without slowing down. Once I was terrified, just so happens, my sister was close. To where I came out, trying to call me to ask if I was ready to leave. I told her that we need to get back as soon as possible. We got back to the room safely, and I told her, Everything that happened. She told me I should call the police, but I was just ready to drop it. We changed our flight and the next night flew back home. I searched for a few years, pretty actively online for a rest in the area, to see if you would ever come up. He never did after a few years. I moved on mentally and got over it. For the most part, it's hands down the scariest moment of my life. I don't know who this guy was, and if he was just saying things to scare me, or if he was serious, but I never want to see him again. I think we must have been 11 or 12, and our friend was having a sleepover for her birthday. She was a part of our group, and we were excited as we had never been to this particular friend's house before her parents put in amazing amount of effort into the party. There was a buffet, barbecue cake, and even a clown. We were kind of embarrassed by the clown. We thought we were too old and it was just awkward. But that was nothing compared to the dad's party games. First one, find the 50 pennies. He had 50 pennies around the house and we had to find them. Only he was chasing us and hooting and really screaming like a hyperactive child. Again, we were embarrassed, but the birthday girl seemed to be having a good time, so we pretended to be in the spirit of things. Then there was the wish game. He wanted us to sit on his knee and tell him a wish. Now I'm really uncomfortable, and I can tell my friend is as well, but the birthday girl's on her dad's knee telling him her wishes. Before we knew it, he's looking at my friend patting his lap. At the time, I thought my friend put in commendable effort not to look horrified, but looking back, there is no way in hell he could have thought she was comfortable sitting on his knee. She sits on his knee and mumbles her wish. And then it's my turn. Fool is me, because I thought I would get a pass for being a boy. But no such luck. He's patting his knee looking at me, so I sat on his lap and told him a wish. Nothing overtly sinister happened, but it creeped us out. After that came the cellar game, that's what he called it. And I'm thinking, hell, no, I'm not going into a cellar with this creepy old man, and I can tell my friend is almost panicking at the thought. But then that dad takes up a rug, and there's a trap door under it leading to the cellar. And then I'm thinking, well, if that's not the coolest thing. So we go down into the cellar. Truth be told, it was pretty cool. At first, the dad had a candle, and that was the only light with the door closed. It was a small concrete room, and we sat on the floor while the dad told us creepy stories. I got the feeling. Those weren't age-appropriate stories, and our parents wouldn't be very happy if they had been there, but that made it all the more cooler. He's telling a story and getting to the creepy revealed bit. Then he blows out the candle. We are plunged into the absolute abute darkness. I'm laughing and shouting, as is the birthday girl, and my friends are really laughing. She actually sounds panicked. We get out of the cellar and I'm saying how cool that was, but my friend looks really upset. Before bed, I manage to catch her alone and ask her whether she's all right. She tells me that after the dad blew out the candle, he tickled her in the dark and kind of put his head into her neck. She's really frightened and makes me promise I'll stay awake with her in case the dad does something my friend falls asleep. And so was the birthday girl, and I'm really tired, but my friend made me promise. And the truth is, I felt like a knight in shining armor. I must stay awake to protect my friends. And lo and behold, I can hear someone coming up the stairs slowly, like they're not trying to make a noise. And then the door opens and the dad sticks his head around the door. He stays like that for what seems like ages, at least 2 or 3 minutes just watching. He mustn't notice me, because I'm not making an effort to pretend to be asleep. Just watching him, watching her. My friend. He then walks into the room and over to my friend. He just stands over her. Watching her, I'm completely freaked out. And despite feeling like a knight in shining armor, 10 minutes ago, I now have no idea what to do. And I can feel pinpricks behind my eyes. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I let it go and made a noise at this. The dad looks my way. I remember his eyes going really wide, and then he sort of scurried really fast out of the room. My heart was hammering away, and I'm looking at my friend, wanting to wake her up. I didn't, though, and at some point I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up the next morning. This happened to me when I was a young boy. I am now in my late 50s, and I haven't thought about being 10 years old. In a long time, I remember it being around my 10th birthday when everything changed in my life for my family. I remember it being the best birthday yet, because my mom had secretly saved up enough money to buy me my own bicycle, and I was more than thrilled no more borrowing my older brother's when he let me, or standing on the back or sitting on the handlebars of a friend's bike. We were by no means well off. When I was young, we didn't have much, so getting that bike had meant a lot to me. My father was a man who worked a lot and drank even more than he worked. I'm pretty sure he was drunk, more than he was ever sober, and because of that he was hardly around. That was okay with me, my siblings, and my mother. For the most part, things were actually nice and peaceful when he wasn't home. And the nights he did come home, we knew right away to steer clear of him, be quiet and leave him alone. We lived outside of a small town down a long dirt road with not very many neighbors nearby. The closest one was a good mile down from us, a really big farmhouse with a lot of fields around them. I remember being friends with their kids as they were around the same age as us, and we went to school together. Their mom was very sweet and always offered us something to eat or drink when we would stop down there. And their dad, well, he was the complete opposite of our father. I never seen him drunk or yell or slap them or their mom around. We knew that not every family was like ours, and that some fathers out there actually seemed to care for them. Like I said, I remember it being around my 10th birthday because my mom had baked a big cake for myself, my brother, and my 2 younger sisters to share, and of course she had some too. Then she took me out back where she had hidden the bike for me in one of the sheds, and I remember screaming with excitement, hugging and kissing her, telling her I loved her, and that she was the greatest mom ever. I hopped on it right away and took off up and down the road to test it out. It was a great feeling in that moment when something so great happens. You kind of forget the regular hell life you seem to live every other day. It's hard to explain, I guess. Things were good. The next couple of days, my father had not really been home for almost a week, probably at that point. Sometimes he would just stop in for a few moments here or there, I guess to check up to make sure my mom hadn't left him or anything. When I was at that age, I hardly recall at any point in time when he was home for more than 1 or 2 nights in a week. Never 2 nights in a row. The kids never knew what he was doing, nor did we ever really want to know. We just knew it was better at home when he wasn't there. I remember riding my bike down the dirt road on my way home from running into town to pick up something at the grocery store for my mom, when from my dad's pickup truck passed me and kept heading on down toward home. It made me want to not even go back home. But really, what else could I do? The sun was starting to go down, and normally if he did come home, it was right after work or very late at night after he left, who knows where. So it was kind of odd. He was on his way home at this time of the day. By the time I pulled up into the yard, I could already hear the yelling. I could hear my mom's voice trying to reason with him for something, and then I would hear my dad's voice just overpower hers. I heard something smash. I didn't want to go inside. I could hear my little sisters bawling, and then I heard my mom crying too. My older brother just happened to be down at the neighbor's place that had the farmhouse. I really didn't want to go inside at this point. Then I heard another smash. I decided to go in, because I couldn't leave my mom and sisters in there alone with him. I peeked in the window of the door before I actually walked in and saw the house getting destroyed right in front of my family by my crazy drunk father. I tried opening the door slightly and getting my sister's attention to come out, But my dad's scene, it went focusing on them to me. I blocked a lot of this out, but from what I can remember, he turned and went straight for me and picked me up by the shoulders and started screaming in my face. My mom was behind him begging him to put me down, but he just turned and gave her another slap in the face, and she backed down from what I could tell that was coming out of him. He was livid when he saw me riding down the road on a bike. He knew wasn't my brother. Brothers, when he got home, he confronted my mom on where it came from. He got out of her that she had secretly been stashing away money to save up to get me the bike, and my dad lost it. When she told him that I'm sure he was probably on a 5 or 6 day heavy drinking binge at this point, I remember the smell of his breath was like sour whiskey pouring into my nostrils as he screamed. At me, he was sure that my mother was hiding other things from him, and he was going to find out what that is. Why he started tearing up the house in the minutes it took him from passing me on the road. Until I got there, he had done quite a bit. All the furniture was thrown around, lamps and pictures had been smashed, and he threw me against one of the walls. And as I looked up from the floor, he had stormed into the kitchen and smashed what was left of my birthday cake against the back door. Both my sisters were huddled into the corner, holding each other while my mom cried and had blood running down her face. That was it for me. This was the worst I had ever seen my father, and I was scared. I ran out of the house, hopped to my bike, and started heading towards the neighbors. We didn't have a telephone at that time, but I knew they did, and I was going to call the police in town and stop him. I hardly got out of the driveway when I heard the front door open and heard my father yelling me to get my ass back there. I just kept on pedaling, thinking I needed to get to the neighbors and everything would be better. That's when I heard his truck start up, and I looked behind me as he was backing out of the driveway, and he started heading towards me. I could see the neighbor's house in the distance, and I just kept on pedaling until I started to see the headlights getting closer and closer. I looked behind me, and he was so close, I knew he was going to hit me. I remember just jumping off the bike towards the side of the road and tumbling into the side of the field. I shot up and just started running across the field towards the neighbors, hearing my dad yelling, but not really caring. When I looked behind me, I seen that my father had already turned around and was heading back towards our house. I got to the neighbors a few minutes later and pounded on the door. Their mom opened the door and took a step back because at this point I was sobbing and shaking and probably didn't look like my normal self. She took me inside and called to her husband to get in there. I was in the middle of telling them what happened, but my brother and his friend walked in from playing out back, and in about 2 seconds he was out the door, heading towards home. The mom called the police in town, and they said they would send someone out right away. About 10 minutes had passed, and no police had shown up, so I begged the husband to please drive me down to my house. I didn't know what was happening, and I was scared he agreed, since he knew my little sisters and my mom were there. About halfway down the road, we passed my bike. It was completely mangled up. My dad had ran it over with his truck. I started crying again, partly because I loved that bike, but mostly because I could have still been on it. When he did that, we get to the house and my father's truck is gone. Apparently, my brother ran all the way home, picked up a baseball bat that was on the side of the house, and with no hesitation walked into the living room and smashed my dad's kneecap in as he laid there screaming. My brother grabbed my sisters and my mother and ran into one of the bedrooms. He managed to crawl out to his truck and drive away, though the cops showed up just a few minutes after the neighbor and I arrived and took a look at everything that happened. They found my dad about an hour later, one town over at the local tavern. I said it wasn't very hard to find him since he was a well-known drunk in the area and the bars were the first places they were going to look for him. They arrested him pretty much on the spot. That night, after the police found my dad, the neighbors invited us to stay with them for however long we needed. To my mom was embarrassed, but so very thankful for their help. We had only stayed a couple of days, enough time for my mom to make arrangements to leave that town and go live with my aunt for a while, and a couple 100 miles away from where we lived. I never did see my father again after that, and I've never really minded that. I know he wasn't in jail too long, because shortly after we got settled into my aunt's is when the phone calls and letters started, but my mom never caved and went back. Who would? After a year or so, he gave up and agreed to a divorce. I never really paid much attention to that, as I was still young and was living a different life than I had before. We stayed with my aunt for a couple of years, until my mom set it up enough money after getting a job to get her own place. At that point, my brother was 16 or 17, so he was also helping bring in money from his job as well as myself. With the newspaper route, I even saved up enough money to get myself another bike. Life was better than it had ever been at the time of this incident. I was 29 and my daughter was 3. I was in my bathroom bathing her and kept hearing a sound that seemed to be coming from the direction of my bedroom window. I wasn't concerned with this sound at first because I live in an apartment complex on the ground level, and people especially kids walk by the window in the mulch all the time, so I continued to bathe my daughter when the sound moved from my bedroom window to my daughter's. Now I noticed the sound shift, and so did my small dog. She's typically the quiet type. As she's 12 years old, the sound was almost as if there was someone tapping a metal object against the glass. Alert at this point, my dog lets out this ear-piercing bark, one I have never heard from her before, feeling on guard. Now I removed my daughter from the tub and wrapped her in her towel and told her to stay in the bathroom as I proceeded to the kitchen and grabbed a knife fight or flight. At this point is kicking in as my dog recedes from the direction of my daughter's room. I approach it, entering the doorway. I begin hearing in a sing-song, love-low, guttury voice. I'm here to play with a very pretty lady. A lady that I know, a lady that I see, a lady that I often see in my dream. Absolutely beside myself at this point, and my fight or flight sense is always in fight mode. I reached the window and drew open the curtains as the voice kept singing the song and the tapping sound kept repeating on the window. I snatched the blind string and opened the blinds quickly, just to come face to face with an old man bearing a long and dirty beard with eyes that sunk into his head. And dark, as the night was, he looked at me and grinned a grin that I can only describe as the one the Grinch wore when he devised his plans, stuck in a shocked panic for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than a second or two. I began to spring into action. I turned, jetted into the bathroom, and grabbed my daughter and my cell phone. I ran to my front door, still holding the knife, just in case the man happened to run towards my door. I was dialing the police and on the phone with the dispatcher as I ran out of my door and to my neighbor's house. I proceeded to bang on her door with as much force as possible to get her attention. I wanted my child safe. At least she flung open her door, upset of course, until she saw the terror on my face as I handed her my daughter and began to force myself into her apartment. The old man came running around the corner and into the breezeway, lunging straight for me with a knife of his own. I managed to get my neighbor, her 3 kids, and my daughter into the door as this maniac arrived within arm's length of me. Slamming the door, I told her to take the kids and get into the bathroom, because that's the only room in the apartment that the door locks and that there's no window. The old man was now banging and kicking her door, as well as dragging the knife down it. I stayed at the door to ensure that he did not make his way inside, and as I'm sitting on the floor, my feet pushed up against the coat closet base and my back firmly against the door, I heard a booming voice drop your weapon and get on the ground. Now I sat listening as the sounds of a tussle came from the breezeway. Then boom, boom, boom. You can open the door, ma'am. It's the police, relieved. I eased open the door in time enough to see the one officer exiting the breezeway with the man. and another asking me if I was okay, and if I could answer a few questions. I spent about 15 minutes explaining the situation to him as he jotted down the notes on his pad. The other officer then approached us with 2 window screens, as the old man had taken the one off my window and my daughter's. In an attempt to get inside, the approaching officer asked me if I recognized the man, and I told him I have never seen him before in my life. This is when the officer looked at me and said that this man admitted having been following me for about a month. He first saw me at the grocery store, which is within walking distance from my apartment. Since then, he had watched and waited for the opportunity to try to get into my apartment to play with me. According to him, this man followed me for a month, and to make it even odder, I would tell my then boyfriend that I felt at times as though I was being watched, and I was scared. The main thing I'm thankful for is that I'm the type of person who locks all the windows and doors, no matter how safe I feel.